Hello Street Talkers and welcome back to the show. This is a special edition. I've been dreaming about this show for what seems like nearly a year now. I first read Kenneth's book about a year ago. But anyway, I hope you enjoy the episode. I'm just sat here sipping a Vita Coca coconut water. Okay, let's go.
To achieve your highest goals, you have to be willing to abandon them.
We have a nose for the interesting. That's how we got this far. That's how civilization came out. That's why the history of innovation is so amazing. Everything washes out when we start ruling by committee. Like, we have to allow people to follow their passions to their extremes. And yet we run society as if this actually makes any sense at all. I think the gradient of interestingness is probably the best expression of like the ideal divergent search. You get to this problem that like, I don't know how to formalize interestingness. What you get to then are proxies for interestingness. That not everything that's novel is interesting, but just about everything that's interesting is novel. It is in my personality and nature to want to overthrow this, I guess we could say, tyranny of objectives.
Okay, a little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. I just want to make it super clear what the structure of this podcast is. So for the first hour and 15 minutes or so, I am introducing Kenneth Stanley's ideas. I'm talking about open-endedness. I'm talking about novelty search and abandoning objectives and Picbreeder and the NEAT algorithm, the neuroevolution of augmenting topologies algorithm. So if this is interesting to you, then feel free to watch the introduction. One thing that people have commented on is that sometimes in our shows we have been using clips from the main show in the introduction and you felt like we were showing you the same thing twice. That hasn't happened. I haven't showed anything at all in the main show in the introduction. It's all fresh content. But if you do just want to skip straight forward to the interview with Kenneth, then feel free to do that. We've got the table of contents, just skip on, and it's about an hour 15 minutes in. Anyway, enjoy the show. Professor Kenneth Stanley is one of my heroes of artificial intelligence.
My particular area of interest and research has been in what's called neuroevolution, which is a combination of neural networks and evolutionary computation.
So I'm saying we got to flip this completely. Like, the smart part is the exploration. The dumb part is the objective part because it's freaking easy.
I personally think that Kenneth's area of research, which is neuroevolution and AI generating algorithms and open-endedness, are the most promising paradigms in AI research. I don't really get this excited about many other areas of AI research, apart from perhaps Francois Chollet's neural program search, which is actually quite related conceptually.
There's nothing really insightful or interesting about just doing objective optimization. Yeah, we've got plenty of good algorithms for doing that, and it's not counterintuitive at all. It totally makes sense, but it's not going to get us hardly anywhere interesting whatsoever.
So today we have an incredible conversation with Professor Stanley, and as you can see, he really enjoyed being on the show too.
This was a great time. This is one of my favorite experiences of any show. So thanks for having me on. It's really an honor to be here.
Dr. Keith Duggar, being the wonderful character that he is, provided a robust rebuttal to many of the ideas in Kenneth's book, and actually it turned into a really interesting back and forth.
And Tim, don't interrupt, please.
Keith is actually quite critical of Kenneth's work. I forced Keith to read Kenneth's book in about June of last year, and he was quite critical of it. We discussed the chapter 7 on education back in September on our episode in Capsule Networks.
I'm going to have this objective where we give you this test and we see how many numbers you can add together in 30 minutes, and then based off of that, we're going to hire the top, 20%. Would we be complaining if their instructors and teachers were manipulating them to perform better and better on that exam? No, because they're actually just causing them to perform better and better at the actual job that they're gonna do. So if the objective is very closely tied to what they actually need to do to be productive or what society needs them to do for some particular application, great. Yep. Manipulate away. Nobody's saying to silence diversity. People are saying that a combination of, let's call it novelty search plus objective optimization is the way to go.
The reason I'm showing you that clip is that there is going to be a clash of views on this podcast, right? Kenneth is a great sport for coming on this show and debating Keith in this way. If I was Kenneth, I would not have come on the show. Keith can be a bit of an animal. So anyway, I hope it will make the show more exciting for you folks. And Kenneth really is a good sport for coming on. So yeah, my kudos to Kenneth.
Interesting. Okay.
Which are some of the key areas that Kenneth Stanley thinks that we need to explore to develop artificial general intelligence?
Divergence, as opposed to our current obsession with convergent algorithms. Populations, as opposed to putting all your eggs in a single basket. Diversity preservation, stepping stone collection, though we know not where those stepping stones may lead. Generating new solutions and new problems at the same time in the same run.
So Kenneth and his co-author, Joe Lemon, penned this book, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. I really recommend that you read the book. I read it myself last May, and it's one of the few books that I've read in my life where I've really kind of changed my opinion on some of my outlook. I've been around the sun quite a few times now, and I've converged in so many different aspects of my thinking. But this book really was a kind of a wake-up call for me. It caused a real stir in my thinking. It's a short book. You can read it very quickly, and I recommend that you do.
We actually wrote a book called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. It's not even about just computer science. Granting agencies are based on objective criteria. They say the first thing they want to know is define your objectives. Tell us how you're going to get there. We'll evaluate your grant and whether we're going to give you money based on the likelihood that this is going to work. Like, how terrible is that when we now understand that sometimes the best way to actually get innovation is to not follow the objective gradient. So this is just totally ridiculous, the way we're running things in our society. And there's so many things in your life that are objectively driven. It's like anytime you do anything, someone says, well, what are you trying to accomplish? What will you accomplish? What is the payoff going to be? Why are you doing this? Like, from the moment you choose your major or even where you're going to go to school and so on throughout your entire life.
Now, is it possible to explore a search space intelligently without using an objective, to align ourselves towards discovery and away from the trap of preconceived results? Kenneth thinks that greatness is possible if we're willing to stop demanding what that greatness should look like. Why are the greatest moments and epiphanies in our lives often unexpected, serendipitous, and unplanned? Nearly 2/3 of adults attribute some aspect of their career choice to serendipity, because the stepping stones that lead to the greatest outcomes are unknown. Not trying to find something can often lead to the most exciting discoveries. YouTube was first envisioned as a video dating site. Flickr was part of an online social game inspired by a pet game. To arrive somewhere remarkable, we must be willing to hold many paths open without knowing where they might lead. One of the things which we'll get more into today is natural evolution itself and what human innovation looks like. Because both of those processes, they proceed without any final objective.
Natural evolution, it didn't solve a problem, it solved innumerable problems. And it continues to solve new problems. So what do I mean by problem? Like, I mean the problem of flight, the problem of photosynthesis, the problem of human level cognition. Like, all of these things were invented in the same run.
Objectives provide a powerful security blanket. They seem to protect us from unknowns. But our world has become so saturated with objectives. Kenneth says that objectives are good when they're modest, but not so if they are ambitious. That is to say, if they entail discovery, creativity, invention, innovation, or happiness. Kenneth thinks that objectives distract us from our passions, or for the correct stepping stones in our lives that we should be taking. They've become a pillar of our culture, but they're also a prison around our potential. How many children do you know who formulate an objective before they go out to play? How many great scientists really formulated a hypothesis before their great idea? Do you ever tell yourself that you can't do something because it's not justified by a clear purpose? Have you ever been told to get your head out of the clouds? There is a tyranny of objectives out there in the world. We rarely talk about the dominance of objectives in our culture, even though they impact us from the very beginning of our lives. Objectives dominate our lives at work. In a lot of professions, the first question you'll hear if you propose a new project is, what's the objective?
I've got a brilliant idea. Why don't we try and increase the levels of groupthink at work? We should start with technical design reviews, and then we should do best practices where every single step of the process is mandated and signed off with stakeholders, and then all of the code that we write must have peer review as well. I really think that this will all unify our minds and objectify everything that we're doing at work. By the way, I'm slightly guilty of this myself, but we need to be able to take the piss out of ourselves a little bit, don't we? And this is what Kenneth meant about ambitious objectives.
If you're a stepping stone away, this is sort of the way we put it in the book, then by all means, use objectives.
We've created a culture in the field of artificial intelligence and machine learning where everything has to be evaluated in order for us to make progress. So I can't submit it to a conference if I don't have a very concrete evaluation metric that's very objective. What we may have to do is to acknowledge that some things are actually subjective. You're talking about creativity. Ultimately, it is in the eye of the beholder. I could argue with you, actually, that everything in nature is not interesting. It's just a matter of opinion. I find it interesting. There's no objective proof that everything is interesting, including us. But we've accepted that it's interesting. We accept that intelligence is interesting. Why are we all pursuing it? And so ultimately, creativity is partially a subjective matter. And there's some interaction between our subjective view of the kinds of things that we find interesting and some modicum of objectivity, which is sufficient at least to present to you an experiment. And that's something we're very uncomfortable with. We want it to be entirely objective. So you may have to grapple with that in order to actually start to really flourish with creative systems.
Why should we have to justify what's interesting to us? We let people spend 30 years of their lives getting up to PhD level, developing a nose for what's interesting, developing strong intuitions. We still don't trust them. We use significance calculations to prove that people are doing the wrong thing. We ask them to provide us with lots of metrics and key performance indicators of how they're doing. These metrics basically stop people from using their education. Intuitions are banned. Any kind of subjectivity is distrusted. This is completely the wrong direction. We should actually be thinking about opening up playgrounds. This is where real innovation happens. We view animals through the lens of survival and reproduction, evolution's assumed objective. People often say that a pursuit is not well defined enough if it doesn't have an objective. The process of setting an objective, attempting to achieve it, and measuring progress along the way has become the primary route to achievement in our culture. Do increasing test scores lead to subject mastery? Is the key to artificial intelligence even related to intelligence itself? Does taking a job with a higher salary bring you closer to being a millionaire?
If you start trying to do things that are really ambitious, you'll run into it. You might say, well, okay, my goal is to be a billionaire or something. Okay, well, now let's measure every decision you make against whether it actually increases your salary. And then think about whether that's going to lead you to becoming a billionaire. Almost certainly not, because the gradient you should be following to get to be a billionaire is probably orthogonal to your salary. It has nothing to do with that. Even if you double your salary, it has nothing to do with whether you're going to be a billionaire. And we get caught in these paradoxes all the time, including objective functions in machine learning. But also, this may be a key step on the path to artificial intelligence. When you think about it, intelligence is one of those so far off goals, the kind of trying to make $1 billion kind of a thing. It's farther than that for sure, because people actually do that. That it is one of those things where it's totally unclear what the path should be.
Let's talk about the Chinese finger trap. The finger trap is a simple puzzle that traps the victim's fingers, often the index fingers, in both ends of a small cylinder woven from bamboo. The initial reaction of the victim is to pull their fingers outwards, but this only tightens the trap. The way to escape the trap is actually to push the ends towards the middle. the complete opposite of your intuitions, which enlarges the openings and frees the fingers. This is a great metaphor for what we're talking about here, right? Because the solution is deceptive. You need to do the opposite of your intuition in order to escape from the trap. Campbell's law, which is well known in the social sciences, says that the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. In other words, social indicators like academic achievement tests are least effective exactly when the objective is to bring them higher. The economy could be stuck in a Chinese finger trap, right? A decrease might be needed to provide a larger increase in the economy later. We might need to see the NHS fail or get worse in order for it to get better. The mistake objectives make is assuming that there's a monolithic trace through their values between now and some good future state. Sometimes things need to get a little bit worse before they get better. There's this notion at the moment that whether it's profit or educational or scientific achievement, that it must increase monotonically every single year, and that is deception. So objectives can create perverse incentives. Campaigns aimed at reducing alcohol abuse or drugs can actually result in more dangerous drugs being used instead. When India was under British rule, the British government tried to exterminate venomous snakes by paying citizens for every dead snake they handed over, but it didn't work the way it was intended. Instead, it led to citizens literally breeding cobras just to kill them for the bounty. Which is incredible, right? So ultimately, the number of venomous snakes in India increased as a result of attempts to decrease it. Many in the UK will remember that objectives took the UK by storm in Tony Blair's government. We had lots of performance metrics around waiting lists and the number of hospital beds that were required. And of course, people would just game the metrics. They would just take the wheels off the trolley beds so that they counted as extra beds. It completely distorts the system. And unfortunately, it removes any intrinsic motivation for people to perform better at work. Objectives can be tyrannical.
Like, the interesting things are actually at the high level, not the low level. Like, what are the incentives that actually help something to like move in the direction of learning the thing I wanted to learn? And everybody has intuitions about incentives.
In education as well, teachers should be allowed more autonomy to follow their battle-tested instincts about which methods foster deep learning and understanding of the materials. And obviously, I mean the other type of deep learning, the real one. But the lesson is that silencing diversity and divergence of approach is a surefire way to slow down progress. And I mean diversity of thought.
Deception is a concept in search, but it's also just a general concept in life, but it's maybe not recognized how serious the problem is. In other words, you're following a path where some performance metric is going up, but you're actually going in the wrong direction. This happens all the time. It's called deception. It happens in machine learning too. And so it leads to what's called like local optima. I mean, people know about this, but what people didn't really recognize and appreciate is just how profound deception is.
Stepping stones are important. The path to greatness is actually unknown. Stepping stones are portals to the next level of possibility. And we have to find these stepping stones. If you're a freshman in college, there may be a path to making $1 million before you reach 30. But what you should do first is probably not so obvious. In other words, you have to search for the right stepping stones, and if you're lucky and clever enough, you might discover the ones that lead to the objective. There may be a number of stepping stones you have to cross, and many of them are likely challenging to figure out. Stepping stones which lead to ambitious objectives tend to be pretty strange, in the sense that they don't resemble the final end state at all. For example, vacuum tubes led to computers. Few saw that one coming. Microwave ovens came from radar technology. It was a lucky accident when Percy Spencer first noticed the magnetron melted a chocolate bar in his pocket in 1946. The internal combustion engine led to aeroplanes. You see, the thing is, creativity itself is a search problem. If we're searching for our objective, then we must be searching through something. The space of all possible things, in a sense, the places that we visited, whether it's in our lives or in our minds, are stepping stones to new ideas. One of the key concepts in this paradigm of search is deception. The measures we use to help us search actually blind us to the stepping stones we should actually take, which is to say, quite clearly, objectives themselves block discovery. It's almost impossible to shortcut the process of innovation. Take human intelligence, for example. We know that single-celled organisms did evolve over billions of years into human beings. So all you need to do is accelerate this process, right? So just select parents that look increasingly human, and voila, you've done it before you know it, right? You've just created humans, but you'd be wrong. So wrong, your pants are on fire.
In fact, I think it wouldn't work if that was what you were trying to do, whatever that would mean. Like, for example, like if we started evolution on Earth with a single cell where presumably it started, and we said, all right, let's get human level intelligence. Let's start working on this. So let's give them IQ tests. You know, like we're gonna just go straight to the heart of the matter. Let's not go through all these silly things like flatworms and stuff like that. Well, I mean, that wouldn't work, obviously. The colony would die when you started throwing it at IQ tests. Just ridiculous.
The problem is that the stepping stones to intelligence do not resemble intelligence. Put another way, human level intelligence is a deceptive objective for evolution. Millions of years ago, our ancestor was a flatworm. It wouldn't score any accolades for its intellect, I can tell you that for now, but its one great achievement was its bilateral symmetry. The stepping stones closest to the shore fade gradually as they wind into the fog. You come upon a fork where a choice must be made. Because of the fog, you don't know where the path leads. Even though the mind is a powerful force in searching, it's still difficult to see further than one stepping stone away, no matter how intelligent you are. We think it's always best to take the road that heads in the direction of your desired destination, but when the objective function is a false compass, it's called deception, which is a fundamental problem in search and in machine learning, because what do machine learning algorithms do, right? They basically just take a gradient of the direction that we're optimizing in and they go in that direction. So these algorithms, they suffer terribly from this false compass. In a way, it's a similar concept that some of you folks might be aware of, which is the exploration versus exploitation trade-off in reinforcement learning. But of course, Kenneth Stanley is talking about something completely different. He sees that kind of exploration as basically a complete waste of time. It's just a random search, which isn't really guided by any notion of interestingness. In GPT-3, we do a greedy search, right? For every next token that we're predicting, we have a probability distribution, and we just greedily take the ones that appear highest probability now, but probably we trace a path which will give us cycles or give us things which are completely crazy because we don't have that view into the fog, so to speak. This is what deception is. Okay, so let's look at an example of deception. So we're in a maze, we're an agent, we take actions in an environment, there's a state action space, and let's say we need to learn some policy using some kind of algorithm. Now, Kenneth would argue that almost every single problem has deception, and the deception is quite simply this. I have some kind of a reward which I'm trying to optimize on monotonically, and that reward is my distance to the goal state. So clearly I hit a wall, I can't intersect the wall, I can't go any closer, and now in order for me to reach the real goal state, I need to actually make my reward look worse for a significant amount of time. Now currently we use things like exploration and exploitation to solve these problems, but Kenneth would argue that exploration is convergent. It doesn't really have any kind of gradient of interestingness. So in Kenneth's work, essentially he relies on this concept of novelty search, because novelty is a proxy for interestingness, and novelty is an information accumulator which you can directly optimize on. But the key concept we want to get across here is that there is more to deception than just the structure of the maze. The search space is not actually the maze itself, right? The search space is the space of neural network topologies underneath, inside your model. Would it be possible for us to define a notion of what interestingness or curiosity actually is?
It's clear that curiosity is fundamental to early development and learning and becoming intelligent as a human is. It's not clear how to actually formalize or motivate curious behavior. because it's not really clear how to formalize what's interesting. And so I don't always think of it in terms of an objective. Okay, now the kid has a new objective, jump on a log, and now the kid has an objective, go play with that doorknob or something like that. As so much as the kid has some notion that certain things are interesting, and it's like a very perceptive notion somehow. And we all have this, but it's different in all of us too. We don't all agree on what's interesting. And so if we want to have curious systems at all the different range of human intelligence, from like a baby up to an adult, like a mature expert in some field, we have to grapple with this very subjective notion of what is interesting. And that means that we have to grapple with subjectivity, which we don't like as scientists, like with benchmarks and stuff. We like being very objective about where we're trying to go. And so to deal with subjectivity, it means that at the ground below a lot of our assumptions, there's going to be something that can't be motivated objectively, like something that is ultimately just something that we believe. And we have to somehow figure out how to get the AI to align with that. Because if we just say, go off and do things that are novel in some completely undefined way, a generic way, then it'll go deviate off into a space that we don't find interesting. How do we align that notion with the things that we actually find interesting so that it can plunder the space that we want to exist within? And so what does that mean? I guess it means that there are things that we have the capacity to do as individuals and together that we need help to do, but we can't do without some help. For example, I know great art when I see it, but I can't produce great art. Or I know great music when I hear it. And somehow these kind of latent capabilities that we have maybe could be made more explicit if we had the right kind of assistance. And so in some way, I think that what AI can do, and would be really exciting if it would do, is just amplify us in our capabilities and give us the ability to express ourselves.
So Kenneth has pioneered this field of open-endedness in artificial intelligence. What exactly do we mean when we talk about open-endedness?
Open-endedness is not how to learn something, like how to learn how to do some particular task. It's really, you can think of it as how to learn everything.
There are properties of evolution in nature, that are just so profoundly powerful and are not explained algorithmically yet, because we cannot create phenomena like have been created in nature.
If you think about something like the history of all of human invention, now that is beyond interesting. And that is, in some sense, an algorithmic process, a process that continually increases in diversity and complexity without bound virtually forever. And in fact, there are a number of different kinds of open-ended processes that we can observe in nature. There's the process of human innovation, which I'm alluding to, but also like natural evolution, for example, which is not human-driven. That's also an open-ended process. It's the ongoing creation of all the diversity of life on Earth. So if you think about open-ended processes, they're not about like a single positive result. It's really not about any particular result at all. It's really about surprise, like an ongoing cacophony of surprises.
As I tried to argue, there's a parallel between our own history of innovation and evolution. I think we're going to continue to pursue these kind of algorithms and also hybridize them with others, including learning algorithms, because after all, that is the world in which we live, where there's an outer loop of evolution and inner loops of learning.
This is the tree of life, and this is a single run, so to speak, of an algorithm called evolution, which generated all of life on Earth. So this is quite incredible. So the process itself is a process of endless surprises. We can't really predict where it's going to be going in the future, and we couldn't have predicted where it has been. And look at the kinds of things that it produces along the way. Like it invented all these things. Like it invented photosynthesis, it invented the flight of birds, it invented, of course, intelligence itself, all in one single run. To get to these really, really far away branches of the tree of life, you cannot have an optimization process. You have to have an open-ended process. But those branches are worth getting to. And what's interesting is we don't have an algorithm like that, including an evolutionary computation. It's not something that invents one thing, it's something that invents everything.
This is not only an explanation for our actual existence because it perceived us and created us, but it also seems deeply entrenched in our nature. We don't actually know what is the property of our universe that has facilitated something that could go on for more than 1 billion years of creativity.
You could come back 1 billion years later and still be surprised at what it's creating.
We don't create systems like this. Like none of the domains or artificial systems we create have this property. So you're just putting algorithms aside for a second. This is a fertile area for research to understand open-ended environments where the surface is still barely scratched.
To understand human-level intelligence, we are going to need to understand creativity. It's a big part of what being intelligent means from a human level, is our creative aspect. We may need to implement and run some kind of creative process or open-ended process that produces this general intelligence. We may not be able to get to this really high level of intelligence without some kind of process that's creative, generating the intelligence itself. What kind of process explains open-endedness and complexity explosions, like things where things just keep on getting more and more complex up to really an astronomical level, like the human brain with its 100 trillion connections? One of the most important ingredients is divergence. It's really important because a lot of the time we're worrying about convergence all the time, converging towards the optimum, converging towards the objective, minimizing this loss. But for open-endedness, if it's important to get divergence, then a lot of our intuitions that we've been building up are not relevant to that kind of a process, because divergence is like the opposite of convergence. The system has to generate the problems and the solutions, and they have to be self-generating. Since no one can anticipate a curriculum all the way up through 1 billion years, it's the system's job itself to generate that curriculum. And this is the key to Earth's open-ended creativity. It's generating both the problems and the solutions. And that's an interesting thought, because where are the problems coming from that we're solving? Well, they're coming from each other. The thing is, we are both the problems and the solutions, like we as the organisms that are being evolved. Because the existence of anything creates the opportunity for something else. So like the existence of trees now makes it possible for us to have giraffes. And giraffes are solving a problem, but the problem was actually created by the trees, which is how do you get to the leaves of the trees when they're high up? And so all of us are creating, or maybe I shouldn't even call it problem, opportunities for each other. The fact that I'm standing up here gives you an opportunity to learn something, but also the fact that you're in the audience gives me an opportunity to talk to you, and so forth. And so we're all creating opportunities for each other all the time, and that is the source of why this process can go forever. And we really would love to produce a truly open-ended algorithm. And the space of problems is a lot different from the space of solutions, isn't it? Like the space of solutions is, we've been grappling with that for a long time. And like deep learning is all about a space of solutions. They happen to be in neural network space, a neural network space. But the space of problems is much harder to understand. And how do you represent problems as opposed to solutions? And what keeps them interesting and meaningful forever? Perhaps to achieve human-level AI, we must travel the road with no destination. There are many destinations that are reachable through no other process than not trying to reach them. And therefore, we have to confront the grand challenge of open-endedness, and I want to highlight that grand challenge of open-endedness. I believe this is a challenge just as worthy as AI, of huge amounts of resources. If we could conquer open-endedness and create algorithms that create forever, we will have opened up a massive sphere of possibilities that's currently not available to us. The power of creation is the power of open-endedness.
So technically, this all started with Yannic Lightspeed Kilcher in ICML 2019. Yannic went to their tutorial, with Kenneth Stanley and Joel Lehman talking about open-endedness and Poet, etc. And it inspired Yannic to make a video on it on his YouTube channel, which was quite nascent back in summer of 2019.
We're not actually talking about an optimization problem, because there's not a particular problem that we're trying to solve. Rather, we're inventing problems and solving them at all times, and there's not anything specifically that we're trying to solve, the less you have an objective. So you can kind of think about that. Like if you have millions and millions of objectives, you imagine millions of people with different objectives, the whole system in aggregate starts to be less objective.
I was kicking myself, actually, because annoyingly I didn't meet Yannic at ICML 19, even though we were both staying in the Westin Hotel. But yeah, I would have found that absolutely fascinating. And fortunately, I found out about it vicariously later through Connor Shorten and obviously meeting Yannic. This is what Yannic had to say at the time.
So I was pleasantly surprised by this tutorial, because I knew almost nothing about these techniques, and they seem really cool. Seems to be a really cool line of research. So started out with what is population-based search, and basically in population-based search you don't want to just reach one solution of a problem, but you want to kind of maintain a population of solutions that you develop over time.
So this is Jeff Clune presenting at ICML 2019. Now, Jeff Clune is incredibly well known in the open-endedness literature, and if you haven't checked out his work, make sure you do. He's a great guy.
So our most recent algorithm here is this POET algorithm, which stands for the Paired Open-Ended Trailblazer. And there is a pair of things happening. There's going to be an algorithm that's generating problems or challenges or training environments.
An observation they make is, if you look at nature and natural evolution, it is very successful even without a goal. So there's no goal in mind to natural evolution except reproduction creates other reproduction. But there's not a goal. That's simply a kind of underlying mechanism. What if we build a search algorithm that only wants to create novel things? So where kind of novelty is the only goal. What happens then?
This is a clip from our first ever episode of Machine Learning Street Talk. We were so excited about this. Connor Shorten recommended that we check out this POET paper, the pairwise open-ended trailblazer. We're going to talk about Uber's recent paper, the enhanced POET, open-ended reinforcement learning through unbounded invention of learning challenges and their solutions by Wang et al. Now, this paper, it introduces a new paradigm of machine learning, which is called AI generating algorithms or open-endedness.
It's all one single run of the same algorithm, and it doesn't really have a goal in mind. So open-ended algorithms are like that. They kind of define an interesting notion. Is it still interesting if we were to just let it run for 1 billion years? Like, would it still be interesting? If yes, consider it an open-ended algorithm.
You might even be asking yourself, why should we be looking at population-based methods to learn, let's say, policies instead of reinforcement learning algorithms?
The reason they're not as well known is because they are population-based methods, and traditional machine learning community does not deal with populations of agents, but a single agent trying to solve a task. But we think that the ideas and the algorithms and the insights behind them are very broadly applicable.
What is the difference between the problems that evolution is better on and the problems that the DeepRL is better on? In terms of surprising results, probably the most shocking result that we found was that there were a few games where random search, so not a GA, just complete random search in this huge high-dimensional network space was actually better than some very good, well-respected, deep reinforcement learning algorithms.
Okay, like we already know all about evolutionary algorithms. You would have learned them in your computer science degree. It seems like we've already got this problem nailed, right? Wrong.
And we also tried to propose some enhancements to like modern kinds of evolutionary algorithms that like sort of protect them from some of the criticisms about evolution. Like, for example, that, well, mutation's completely random, so it's unprincipled compared to SGD, which is actually looking at the gradient and following that in some kind of principled way. So we introduced like new kinds of mutation operators that actually are gradient-informed mutation operators. So it's kind of mixing paradigms in a way to make the point that, you know, when we criticize evolutionary algorithms because, like, say, it's just random or something like that, it's kind of a myopic view.
The main thing that current genetic algorithms do not have is divergence. What they do have is diversity. They maintain a separate population of individuals, and then they do crossover and random mutation and all that good stuff. But the fascinating thing about real evolution is divergence. And one characteristic of that is that evolution is continuously providing new problems and solutions to help agents, if you like, maximally exploit the environment that we're in. So divergence is super important. And then you might think, well, does that imply that GAs now are convergent? Yes, they are. And one of the main reasons they converge is because they have one fixed objective, which means if you run it for a significant amount of, or not, maybe not even a significant amount of time, if you run it, it will converge on a kind of local optimum, and then that's it. It will no longer continue to improve.
There's something wrong here, because evolutionary algorithms, what I'm just talking about here, they also converge. They converge, and then they basically give you your solution, or they get stuck like any other machine learning algorithm, and then that's the end. And it basically, by the way, is the same story with deep learning or anything, basically. They find what you're looking for. Maybe they find a few things you're looking for, then it's the end. Or if it doesn't work out well, they don't. But either way, it's the end.
Natural evolution is still diverging and doing something interesting. Interesting's the key word, right? Because divergence just for the sake of divergence, that could be the worst thing in the world. We don't want to be doing completely random things that aren't interesting. So what does interesting mean? Well, interestingness simply means that you're accumulating information, right? The amount of information that you have is growing. And what does that information mean or do? Well, it could be anything. It could be helping the agents in your world exploit the environment better.
Novelty is kind of a proxy for it. Novelty is not equivalent to interestingness. Interestingness is richer and also harder to formalize, but novelty is kind of close to what interestingness is. And so the idea is, what if you only followed gradients of novelty? And novelty is just really fascinating as a gradient, because it's actually very well informed, because it's basically a comparison of where you are to where you were in the past. And so it's actually just really the opposite of an objective, because an objective is comparing where you are to where you want to be in the future. But neither has more information. Like, people have this intuition when they hear about this that novelty search is kind of random, but objective search is like not random because you're comparing to the objective. But that couldn't be further from the case. I mean, there's actually more information about the past than the future, because it actually was there. So I know what I actually had. And so I can compute novelty with respect to some record of where I've been in the past and have a very defined gradient.
But the really interesting thing about information accumulation as opposed to any other objectives is that there is one direction, right? It does monotonically increase. Information accumulation is the only objective which does increase monotonically, but we shouldn't think of it as an objective. The whole point of Stanley's conception is that there is no one objective. It's more like meta-learning, where there are an infinite sea of objectives which are learned through some kind of search process, right? And the fascinating thing about these systems is that when you have the diffuse diversity of objectives, then in a sense there is no objectiveness to the system at all, because it becomes completely fluid, and for that reason it can accumulate information and it can diverge continuously.
What it illustrates when you sometimes win with novelty is just how profoundly weak objectives are in terms of like really being a good guiding light. They're just so much less than you think they are. It's an absolute embarrassment for objectives that something that doesn't even know what problem it's trying to solve is doing better at solving the problem than the objectively driven version of the same exact algorithm.
The other fascinating thing that we explore in the show today is that our existence is not entirely explained by selection. So we've been thinking about this entirely the wrong way. It's actually the operating search structure which is exploited by evolution. That's what makes it so interesting.
If you really think you understand something from an AI perspective, then you should be able to formalize it and write it down, and then it should give me what I'm asking for. So if that's all evolution is, then let's just write it down, and then we'll have open-endedness, and you've just revolutionized the field. And which is why I think it probably is not just that. It's probably not just anything that anybody here thinks it just is. You may have read your biology textbooks, and you may think that you know what evolution is, and it may make sense, but actually I can almost assure you that there's going to be a few counterintuitive kind of curveballs that are thrown into that story that we learned in high school, which aren't in the textbook, because if there weren't, we would just take the textbook and formalize it, and it's not that simple, and people have been trying to do this for 50, 60 years. So evolution is a very complicated and subtle process, and what we mean by it is different than just optimization if we're talking about the open-endedness aspect of it, which is probably the more interesting aspect of it. If you're just saying from an optimization perspective, like how can I explain why hyenas are as fast as they are? Okay, there maybe you can give me an explanation, but that's not the same as sort of formalizing the whole thing as a process that's going to produce this kind of grandiosity of nature on Earth.
Open-ended search is definitely a cool research direction, and I encourage you to check it out.
All of the different challenges that you're seeing here were invented by the algorithm as it's running, and also the agent that is solving that problem was also invented at the same time. And over time, these environments get more and more complicated. We did the counterfactual. We went back to the 298 agent, and we just ran it forever. We gave it tons and tons of computation, and it was stuck on a local optima. It never stood up. If you just let that thing run forever, it only gets a score of 309, and it keeps that knee on the ground for whatever reason, because the landscape is deceptive. So counterintuitively, in this particular problem, you had to go from a simple problem to a harder problem, and then come back to the simple problem in order to get the right solution to the simple problem, which is just a curriculum that a human would never design, but these algorithms figure out on their own, which is the beauty of these things. Just dropping an agent in that environment and trying to solve it because there's no curricula to get there, or by taking kind of like what you would see as the direct path. Here are some solutions that traditional optimization cannot solve, but Poet does find a solution to some of these really, really crazy environments. Any of these really challenging problems, when you go back and look at it, you cannot directly optimize to solve that problem. So very quickly, Poet is kind of quality diversity plus, because as Ken said, it breaks the mold. It now can generate its own niches in addition to trying to have all of the other properties. Is it truly open-ended? Well, no, it's not, because, well, it's definitely a step closer because it's generating its own niches. It's currently limited by the fact that we picked a specific physics simulator and a specific way to parameterize environments in that physics simulator.
The stepping stones that lead to where you may want to go are only accessible to you if you open your mind and are willing to actually accept things that don't look better objectively. So I like to give the example of walking. Like on the road to learning to walk, you have to learn about oscillation. But if you just start oscillating your legs while you're standing or something like that, you'll just fall on your face. But if I look at it from like, is that interesting? It's very interesting. It's a completely new idea. I've never seen that before. So in the novelty version of the world, I would be like, okay, let's go down that path. I don't know where this leads, but it's something I haven't seen before. But in the objective version of the world, I'm like, nope, try something else. So what will I try? Like, I'll try like lunging as far as I can, or something that's in the short term, like looks like I'm actually making progress, but in the long run, it's going nowhere, because you're not going to be able to walk based on just like throwing your body forward as fast as you can. But the larger lesson is just like, let's take seriously other gradients, like the gradient of novelty.
So this serves as an interesting lesson for GOFAI advocates, good old-fashioned AI. There are many good old-fashioned AI folks challenging machine learning and the statistical approaches to AI, saying that knowledge is universal and should be explicitly constructed. But what about knowledge which is not yet in our possession? Kenneth and Joel's poet paper demonstrates explicitly that there's plenty of knowledge about existing earthly systems which we don't fully understand. We understand the what, but not the how. The how will only become known, possibly, through some open-ended discovery process, because the stepping stones to that final knowledge, the how, will not in any way resemble the current what that we have in our minds. So in a sense, knowledge engineering is only possible if you understood it in the first place. If we understood how to build a compiler for language, then natural language understanding would be solved. We don't understand it. That's the whole problem, right? It's the same thing. Convolutional neural networks, they started dominating the computer vision world after 2012, and it was precisely because the representations learned as part of the training process were better than any handcrafted features. It was a complete game changer. And even now, we don't fully understand how they work. We have to resort to all sorts of esoteric methods to do interpretability on these models, but that's just the way it is. But have you noticed now that GOFAI people, they recognize neural networks as being part of the architecture for any AGI system? They use the term perception, right? So perception means a module which cannot be explicitly crafted with knowledge because it's not understandable yet by humans. Even Bayesian aficionados, they point out the lack of causal inferencing in these neural network models. They just say, look, they are statistical correlation machines. There's no causal factors. And yeah, in a sense, they're true, but I'm not really sure their alternative is better. What they are proposing is that you impute the causal factors into the model architecture explicitly, right? So you already know what the causal factors are. You know that male testosterone causes car accidents, so you build a probabilistic graphical model that has that causal factor in. Well, yeah, that's great if you know what the causal factor is, right? What about all of the causal factors out there that we don't know? Bayesian approaches are not going to help you then, are they? What we need to have is a new way of discovering that knowledge, and potentially Kenneth Stanley's approach might be leading us in that direction, right? Because Stanley instead explores the seemingly infinite space of knowledge which is not yet known. Interestingly, he focuses on information accumulation as being one of the core kind of tenets of his paradigm, and in recent years also discovering new problems and new solutions in tandem rather than solutions to one specific task. Okay, so an amazing blog dropped this morning by this guy Mark Sarafim. Actually, we're getting him on the podcast at the end of February, so you can look forward to that. But he just wrote this wonderful article called Machine Learning, the Great Stagnation, right? And I'm not going to spoil the surprise too much because, of course, we'll be talking to Mark. But he leads by saying academics think of themselves as trailblazers, explorers, seekers of the truth. Any fundamental discovery involves a significant degree of risk. If an idea is guaranteed to work, then it moves from the realm of research to engineering. Unfortunately, this also means that most research careers will invariably be failures, at least if failures are measured by objective metrics like citations. So the construction of academia was predicted on providing a downside hedge or safety net for researchers where they can pursue ambitious ideas. So Mark points out that academics sacrifice material opportunity costs in exchange for intellectual freedom. Society admires risk takers, for it's only, their heroic self-sacrifice that society moves forward. But he points out that most of the admiration and prestige that we have towards academics are from a bygone time. Economists were the first to figure out how to maintain the prestige of academia while not taking any monetary or intellectual risk. They'd show up on CNBC Finance talking about corrections or irrational fear and exuberance. So Mark says that it's hard to point the blame towards any individual researcher. After all, while risk is good for the collective, it's almost necessarily bad for the individual. However, this risk-free approach is growing in popularity and has specifically permeated machine learning, right? The FANG salary with an academic appointment is the best job available in the world today. And with all of the SOTA chasing, we're rewarding and lauding incremental research as innovators, increasing their budgets so that they can do even more incremental research, parallelized over as many employees or graduate students that report to them.
What exactly are you doing?
Yeah, I've just been really busy chasing SOTA. So he's fundamentally saying that, machine learning researchers now can engage in risk-free, high-income, high-prestige work, and they are today's medieval Catholic priests. This is an absolutely hilarious article. I mean, I'm not going to spoil all of it for you, but I'll do a bit more. So machine learning PhD students are a new kind of investment banking analyst in Mark's opinion. Both seek optionality in their career choices, but differ in superficial ways, like preferring meditation over parties and marijuana and Adderall over alcohol and cocaine. So he points out that a machine learning PhD is now kind of like an extended interview for the tech industry, whether it's Facebook or Microsoft and Google. The entire data science interview process at the larger labs has now just become a mix of trivia and prestige. Checking out your portfolio would take far too long. It's far easier just to say, well, have you graduated from Stanford or do you have a paper co-authored with Google Brain? That's a good filter. So yeah, he says that, matrix multiplication is all you need. He's got some absolutely hilarious memes here. So you're telling me it's all matrix multiplications? Always has been. Yeah, some of these things are brilliant. Rise of the Transformers, attention is all you need. Transformer on proteins, transformers on molecules, transformers on images, fast transformer. Transformers are graph neural networks, learning to transform with transformers. Oh, this is hilarious as well. So he's got this concept called graduate student descent and the death of first principles. This chart below describes how graduate student descent works. So essentially you initialize, you find the SOTA on archive, you find the code on GitHub. If worse, you make random changes and then you publish. So this is it's a bit of a piss take, but to be honest, it's not too far from the truth. Statistical learning. Gentlemen, our learner overgeneralizes because of the VC, the Vapnik-Chervonescus dimension of our kernel is too high. Get some experts and minimize the structural risk in a new one. Rework our loss function, make the next kernel stable, unbiased, and consider using a soft margin. Language models in particular, like GPT-3, are starting to feel a lot like the Large Hadron Collider. But no, language has ontologies, which you're not capturing with self-supervised learning. Your approach isn't research because it's not sample efficient like humans. You can't even interpret the weights. And the other was like, ha 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 ha, Azure go. Hilariously, he points out that BERT engineer is now a full-time job. Qualifications include, and I'm guilty of this by the way, some bash scripting, check. Deep knowledge of Pip, waiting for a new Hugging Face model to be released, check. Watching Yannic Kilcher's new Transformer paper the day it comes out, guilty as charged. Repeating what Yannic said at your team reading group, guilty as charged. It's kind of like DevOps, I'm all over that by the way, but you get paid more. Yeah, so I mean, obviously we've got to be able to take the piss out of ourselves a little bit in the machine learning community, but you could say that this is just shit posting, but there's obviously a large kernel of truth to what Mark is saying. Yeah, so in parting at the end, he says that he's sad to see that the most exciting work in machine learning is coming from outside of machine learning. He says he's spent 10 years in this field and he learns more from the crackpot outsiders on Twitter today than he does from peer-reviewed papers, and I think that says quite a lot, really. Anyway, we're talking with Mark at the end of February, so I hope you look forward to that. It's quite an interesting piece here as well about the Biontech vaccine, which was recently approved. And this lady, Katalin Kariko, she pioneered this work into mRNA therapeutics and vaccines going back many decades. But the problem was that this article tells a really fascinating story about when she was at her lowest ebb. She was a biochemist at the University of Pennsylvania, and she dedicated like the previous 2 decades of finding a way to turn one of the most fundamental building blocks of life, mRNA, into a whole new category of therapeutics. And she found herself hitting lots of dead ends. To cut a long story short, there was a problem with using mRNA because there was an immune response from humans, and that needed to be attenuated. So her bosses just ran out of patience. She got demoted, and she basically got told that she couldn't work on this anymore. And this is a wonderful example of groupthink and objectives in a way, because we can't trust innovation centers or universities or companies to innovate, because to innovate you have to basically explore into the unknown. And this was a wonderful example of, luckily this woman had the initiative and the persistence and the perseverance to continue with her dream. She really believed deep down that she could make this work, and she placed herself at considerable personal hardship and risk to make it happen. And then because of this incredible work from this woman, we now have another vaccine for coronavirus, which we wouldn't have had otherwise. So it goes to show that we really need folks out there like Katalin who pursue their passions and interests and innovate for the benefit of all of us.
So Picbreeder was influential in the genesis of a lot of the ideas that we've been discussing today. Just for the audience, like, where does all this come from?
This was like a website where you can just breed pictures. But the kind of clever twist of that was that if you bred a picture, basically you would be evolving the pictures. Like, you choose a picture and it would have babies, and then you could choose the ones that you like and they would have children and so forth. And then you could like publish your picture on our website that you found by evolving it. But this clever twist is that you could then, someone else could come in, see your picture, and then branch and start evolving from there. So we had people evolving from where other people left off. And so it was kind of an experiment at some level.
So it's sort of like, it's like what you might think of if you're breeding horses or dogs or something like that. But in this case, it's just pictures. And so you could go online and see some blobs, and you could choose the blob you like, and it would have children that look kind of like it but are a little bit different, just like if you're breeding a horse or a dog or something like that. But the key thing that makes it sort of special is that, and sometimes it's called genetic art, by the way, some people may have heard of that, or evolutionary art. But the thing that made Picbreeder special is that it was a website. So if you did discover something or breed something that was cool, you could publish it, press a button that says publish, and it would go back to the site, and then somebody else could come in and then breed from there.
So they start out with a very simple pattern, and you just have the opportunity to kind of, you pick one, and it gives you a bunch of random perturbations of the procedurally generated image, and you pick the ones that you like, and then you continue exploring from there. And if you're happy, you can just save that to the database, and someone else can look through the database and then pick yours, for example, to continue.
So people were building on things that people built on, that people built on, that people built on. It's basically standing on the shoulders of your predecessors. And you end up getting this giant branching phylogeny of pictures. And it was ultimately, for me, and I don't know, it's obviously subjective, but it was ultimately, for me, astonishing what people discovered. Like, these were generated by little tiny neural networks, and we had skulls and butterflies and cars and stuff like that. And so it turned out that, yeah, the notion of what's interesting, which every person has a different notion, was instrumental in allowing that process to happen in what I think is a completely phenomenal process of discovery. Because, like, the number of iterations involved in, say, finding something like the skull was in the dozens. Like, think about that compared to deep learning, thousands or millions or billions of iterations. This is like dozens of iterations to find things that are absolutely extremely rare needles in a haystack. What is the explanation for that? Indeed, part of it is that we have a very, very strong nose for the interesting as human beings, and that it's diverse. We're not all looking for the same stuff.
And the things that the humans came up with, or that the result of that was extremely interesting.
Now, something like Picbreeder is much more kind of like close to like actually following gradients of interestingness, because it's human beings that are making the decision, and humans arguably make decisions on what's interesting. What is it that makes systems like Picbreeder work so effectively? open-ended systems in general. And what it is basically it's the connection between one stepping stone and the next.
You're just doing things that are random. Like people in Picbreeder are not doing things that are random. It's not like just clicking randomly on images, just hoping something good happens. They're obviously doing things for some reason. Why are they doing them? It's like if I click on this and then it leads to like some pattern like that's symmetric or something, and I like it, it's not because I'm like, oh, well, now I'm going to get a butterfly. It's because the pattern in its own right is just interesting to me. And this is not like a random fact. This is based on like the full force of all of my intelligence is still being put on to making this decision that I like this pattern. So it's hardly a trivial gradient that I'm following.
That connection. Like if there's a very, very salient stepping stone for you, just for you, this could change your life. Like if you look at this picture of this butterfly or something like this, it will not be true of the majority of people. And so we will never get to follow down that path if it's a majority rules type of voting situation. We need you to be able to follow your special instinct, because that was the thing that could change only your life. The system is designed basically to try to raise things up that people find interesting. The images that were discovered by Picbreeder users were discovered by people who were not trying to discover them. And that is because of deception. I have to make a strong argument that Picbreeder actually is like real life. And I do think it is. And the reason that I think it is because Picbreeder is actually much, much simpler than real life. Like in Picbreeder, if you take any arbitrary image, like the skull, and you say, okay, well, how would I get there from scratch? Like, we don't really know how to get there from scratch. Like, that metric of improvement of like how close are we to a skull is not the right one for following that trajectory through the search space. That's basically the definition of a hard problem. Like, if you knew what the stepping stones were, it wouldn't be hard. We would just follow the stepping stones, of course.
Sometimes you have to be following the other. By other, I mean not the objective gradient, not the thing that leads to where you're hoping to go, but something that leads somewhere along a different line, but which has value anyway. In every case where something really cool was discovered, like say a car or a butterfly or something like that, there is some predecessor image, in other words, an ancestor, where the person who discovered that ancestor was not trying to get the thing that was ultimately discovered. And this is like 99.99% of cases. It is an experiment in evolutionary computation, but it's also an experiment in like mass level collaboration, like huge massive collaboration, but where there's no explicit collaboration. So nobody's talking to somebody else like, how am I going to work with you? Like, who should I work with? It's just, here's this artifact I discovered, hand it off to the world, and then someone else might take that baton and then move it forward again. And we got really, really large branching phylogenies is what you would call it, like trees of evolution, because people would branch off of people. And we could actually show it as a graph, like these huge phylogenies of pictures, basically, and just amazing pictures were discovered. Things that you wouldn't think that from just random blobs you could evolve things like cars and butterflies and skulls and all kinds of very recognizable objects were evolved. And certainly it's some kind of a democratization, it's like humans in the loop. So it's kind of different from Nero in sense it's like a mass, many people experiment, but it has this extra element, which is that like there is a lot of potential for the combination of learning in humans, where we still are better at certain things than AI. And this is what we call divergence. In other words, the system, rather than converging to the uber image, whatever that might mean, is actually diverging across the space of all that's possible and collecting stepping stones. Extremely valuable as an example of how an open-ended process can develop, because we know every single choice that was made. You can only get to these things by not trying.
So Picbreeder was a website that was launched a very long time ago now, and I can't really demonstrate it properly because it's not working without Java applets, and I don't think anyone uses Java applets anymore. So you can see the parents and the children. So this particular one had this parent, and then that parent, and then that parent. And the fascinating thing with Picbreeder is that quite often the parents do not even resemble the children, although in this case it kind of does. Quite interesting. So when we go up the tree high enough, we see that the parents were just basically blank images. So there was a rating system on there. You could see which the best images were rated. So there were foxes and ghosts and a lot of kind of anthropomorphic images as well, which shouldn't surprise you given that humans are, essentially supervising the process. You can see the highest rated images here. Some of them are fascinating. That looks a bit like a monkey. That looks a bit like a baby's face. Some fruit. How are these things generated? Well, it's easier than you think, actually. So this was the original Java application that people used to use for Picbreeder. Essentially, it's a human augmented distributed evolution algorithm, and the population included individuals which were compositional pattern producing networks, or CPPNs. Now, it's not as complicated as it sounds. They're right here, actually. So a CPPN is a neural network that takes in a spatial input and has an output in 3 color channels. So we have an RGB. Now, there are 4 inputs here. I can't remember exactly what the 4 inputs are, but basically think of it as an X and a Y. Maybe there's a bias in there or something. But what happens is the user clicks on the result. So this is the underlying pattern producing network, and then there'll be a result which is shown. So, for example, those ones I just showed you there, they all produce slightly different results, and they produce different results because they're variations of each other. They have a slightly different topology, or they might have different weights or activation functions. The activation functions that are used are just an optional set as well, so you can just check all of those off. So the only thing we're missing here really is, how do we make that evolution algorithm produce mutations and crossovers in the neural network space? Because we're actually searching through the space of neural network topologies, if you think about it. And that is using something called NEAT. Okay, so a very long time ago now, Kenneth Stanley pioneered this algorithm called NEAT, which is evolving neural networks through augmenting topologies. And basically it was an evolutionary algorithm for neural networks, a population-based method. And what do you need to do to implement an evolutionary algorithm? Well, you need to know how to represent neural networks and cross them over and mutate them. And there was also a challenge as well, because as you'll remember from our conversation with Max Welling, you have these symmetries, especially on topology, right? So you can have 2 graphs which are basically the same thing. They are symmetry transformations of each other. But the problem is when you cross over those 2 networks, they can kind of cancel each other out. And this is what Kenneth Stanley called the competing conventions problem. So we need to have a system that can solve that. Okay, so the core concept with NEAT is, how do you represent neural networks in such a way that you can mutate them later? So we have the concept of a genome, and this basically just is a list of all of the things that's ever happened to a particular neural network. So you can see the nodes and you can see the connections. What's interesting about this neural network is that number 5 came along later. So originally 2 is connected to 4. So you can see here that number 5 got added, and it's just like a stack. You just add all of the innovations on forever. It's a bit like a transaction log in a database or something like that. You kind of keep a record of everything that happened before. So number 5 came along, and you can actually see here that we've got all of the innovation numbers in monotonically increasing sequence. And the interesting thing is that one of them has been disabled. Well, I wonder why that is. Well, this particular one is going from 2 to 4, so from there to there. And it needed to be disabled because now 5 is in the way. So 5 came along, and then you can see here the sequence of things that happened. So now we've got one going from 2 to 5, which is there, so that was added. And of course this was disabled straight away. And then we've got from 5 to 4, right? And then the last one is from 4 to 5, and then 1 to 5. So presumably 5 got added, this connection got added, the original connection between 2 to 4 was deleted, and then we had 2 new connections between 2 to 5 and 4 to 5. So how do we do mutations? Well, let's have a look. So if we wanted to add a connection to this network, let's say from 5 to 3, all we do is we add a new innovation number on the end, so innovation 7, and we just say 3 to 5. Okay, easy. What if we wanted to do something a little bit more complicated? So we wanted to add in a new node here, 6. So this is a node that didn't exist before. Well, in order to do that, we'd have to disable the original connection, right, from 3 to 4, because now we've got 6 in the way. So this one's a little bit more complicated. So here we put an innovation 8 in, going from 3 to 6, and then 9 going from 6 to 4, and we delete the old innovation from 3 to 4. So yeah, this is a population-based method. So of course we have many different types of topology going on, but they will all be sharing the same kind of genome, if you like, but of course they'll be specialized in the sense that some of them will have additions in terms of innovations, or some of them will have previous innovations disabled. So you can imagine how we can make an algorithm to do this automatically, because it's basically just a random mutation. So you just need to essentially come up with a place to put your new node, which activation function do you want, which weight do you want, and so on. So that's reasonably straightforward. The next thing, of course, is in the world of Picbreeder, it's a human augmented process. So the humans basically pick the children, and then the crossover is performed. So how do you do the crossover? Well, the beauty of having this innovation system is you just kind of like line up all of the innovations, and if there are any disabled, so it's like an OR on the disabled, then the child is disabled. So here, for example, if we cross over these two parents, because one of these is disabled, then the child must be disabled as well. If there are any gaps, then it just gets filled in, and that's basically how you produce the offspring. So this offspring gets the 8 from parent 1, everything else comes from parent 2, and then if there are any disabled nodes, then the offspring is disabled, and then it produces this child topology. So it's actually surprisingly simple, and this is the foundation of how Picbreeder works. But yeah, this NEAT algorithm is absolutely fascinating, because probably most of you are reinforcement learning aficionados, and you haven't really thought about using any other approaches for, let's say, building policies for controlling agents. And I think this is a fairly cool example on GitHub I found, where someone had used NEAT to learn a policy to control the game of Snake, and this was the topology which was found, through this population search, and it works incredibly well. You don't necessarily have to use reinforcement learning, which should be interesting for some of you to hear. So how do I apply these ideas in my life? Well, there's a trade-off, isn't there, between things that will pay off, investments of your time, versus investing in things or creating a fertile ground for discoveries. So there's an interesting dichotomy between the manufacture and discovery of opportunities in our lives. I got a message on Steam the other day from someone who wanted to play Counter-Strike with me. Now, I've known this person for years. Presumably he plays Counter-Strike 20 or so hours a day. Do I want to play Counter-Strike? No. It's not interesting to me. I have a sense that it's not going to lead anywhere interesting. I mean, of course, we don't really know where things lead, but we have an innate sense for interestingness, and it's different for all of us. Perhaps if I wanted to get a career in esports or something like that, then I would find that investment would pay off for me, but I invest in other things. You might ask yourself, why am I running this YouTube channel? I don't monetize it. I don't get any money from it. I don't get anything from it. Well, that's not true at all, right? First of all, it's incredibly serendipitous that I met Yannic. It was at ICML 2019. I was there and Yannic was there. We were both staying in the same hotel, but we didn't meet each other then. In fact, I didn't even go to the tutorial on open-endedness, and he did. He made a video about it. Connor Shorten then reached out to Yannic because of that video, and then I happened on Connor Shorten's videos, and he introduced me to Yannic, and we decided to make this YouTube channel together. That was pure luck. It was serendipity. And I do this YouTube channel because, it leads to so many interesting opportunities later. I could build an audience of people that trust me. Maybe I could monetize it later. Maybe it will lead to career opportunities. It's a forcing function for me to get really good at all the latest and greatest in AI. It means that I can facilitate lots of conversations with people that I wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. It's an incredible, all-round, fertile kind of cultivation process for opportunities. So this is open-endedness manifested in my life. I have a strong intuition that it will lead to something very interesting later, whether I'm learning more about machine learning and artificial intelligence, I'm learning about creative pursuits, whether it's making 3D renders or video editing or graphic design, my communication skills, my written skills. If you want to have an all-round kind of skill acceleration process, I thoroughly recommend you all to start your own YouTube channel, because within a couple of years, any weak links are accentuated greatly. It's very easy to do an audio podcast. It's very easy to do a blog. Try doing a YouTube channel. It's an order of magnitude more difficult. One of the key messages that Kenneth is talking about is that we should all be treasure hunters. We should identify some domains of what's interesting to us, and we should create a fertile environment to maximize the number of opportunities we have, because it's a numbers game at the end of the day. Opportunities do come and arise, and we should have the same idea in science and in engineering and just in what we do at work. We should be building platforms and building systems that create and manufacture opportunities and cross-pollination. So by being a treasure hunter, it means that all the things that we hoped might happen in the future will become more likely. Because, the more stepping stones we have, the more places that we can get to. The stepping stones you end up on might not be where you had planned to go, but Kenneth would argue you shouldn't be planning anyway. Anyway, I really hope you've enjoyed the show today and will enjoy the interview with Kenneth. It's been so much fun making it. This has been... I've been planning to make this particular show for what seems like an eternity now, and there have been so many events that have conspired against me, so I'm so glad to finally get this out there. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. We love reading your comments, and we'll see you back next week.
I gotta say, I'm both disappointed and intrigued that you're no longer at UCF. I was so looking forward to visiting you down on campus one day when I visit family in Florida. But now you're at this cool place, so that would have been cool. Equally cool place.
Welcome back to the Machine Learning Street Talk YouTube channel and podcast with me, Tim Scarf, and my two compadres, MIT PhD Dr. Keith Duggar, Yannic Lightspeed Kilcher, and today we have an incredibly special guest, Professor Kenneth Stanley. Now, I've been dreaming about getting Kenneth on the show since the very beginning. Some of you might recall that our first ever show was on the Enhanced Poet paper, the pairwise open-ended trailblazer. And of course, Kenneth had his hands all over that. Kenneth held a Charles Millikan professorship and was a full professor at the University of Central Florida. He's an associate editor at the Frontiers in Robotics and AI, and also the IEEE Transactions on Computational Intelligence and AI in Games. He's on the advisory board for the O'Reilly Artificial Intelligence Conference and the Spring Natural Computing book series. He's been cited over 16,000 times. His most popular paper, with over 3,000 citations, was the NEAT algorithm, which is evolving neural networks through augmenting topologies. And that's a genetic algorithm for the generation of evolving artificial neural networks. He's currently a research science manager at OpenAI in San Francisco. He was a senior research manager at Uber for 3.5 years. He completed his PhD in computer science from the University of Texas in Austin. His interests are in neuroevolution, open-endedness, neural networks, artificial life, and artificial intelligence. He invented the concept of novelty search with no clearly defined objective. His idea is that there's a tyranny of objectives prevailing in every aspect of our lives, society, and indeed our algorithms. Crucially, these objectives produce convergent behaviour and thinking and distract us from discovering stepping stones which might lead to greatness. He thinks that this monotonic objective obsession, this idea that we need to continue to improve benchmarks every single year, is dangerous. Sarah Hooker recently spoke about the hardware lottery, how the previous software and hardware decisions enslave us. But in my opinion, the objective lottery is so much worse. He wrote about this in detail in his recent book, Greatness Can't Be Planned, which is the main topic of discussion in the show this evening. He introduces several very important concepts: the false compass or deception, treasure hunting. We should all be treasure hunters, my friends. This book has really touched me in particular, modifying many of the key aspects of my personal philosophy in life. So I'm very indebted to Kenneth for writing that book. Kenneth Stanley, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tim. It is an honor to be here. I'm really happy to be on this show. I've enjoyed this show. I've watched this show before, and really happy to actually be here finally myself. So thanks.
Amazing. You have a very interesting philosophy, which is quite contrarian, actually, because as you said, objectives seem to dominate our lives and society. And from the very beginning, you've been pushing against that grain, if you like. So where did it come from?
Well, before he answers that, is it a fair assessment that Tim just gave? Because, for example, when I read the abandoning objectives white paper, it's not remotely as extreme as like a tyranny of objectives, et cetera, dominating our life. It's much more nuanced. Mm-hmm. Like it says, hey, look, maybe the best approach is to take, some of the things we find in novelty search and then apply objective-based optimization to them. And if we kind of look at the history of humanity, it has been this dual-sided coin, I mean, out-of-the-box thinking is nothing new. Serendipity is nothing new. Exploration's always been a big part of human endeavors. And yet even the scientific method, right, begins, the first step is observe, hypothesize, right, test, repeat. So, I mean, we've always had this dual-sided coin of explorer combined with optimizing those results.
How many great scientists formulated their hypothesis before their discovery?
I'd say all of them observed before they hypothesized. And observation is exploration.
Okay, interesting. I guess this is, I think the question that Tim is asking is more, I'm interpreting more as a personal question of like how I came to these views. And Keith is rightly pointing out that we can't simply dismiss all objectives in the world. I mean, obviously there is an important role for objective pursuits in the world, but nevertheless, I think it's true that, like, even though I recognize that, so I'm not on this exact extremum of the spectrum. I mean, that's just not where I am. Even though I recognize that, I think it's true that I'm just tend to be more of a radical on this particular axis. It is in my personality and nature to want to overthrow this, I guess we could say, tyranny of objectives, even though I do recognize that certainly sometimes they have merit and have to be used and followed. But it's true that sort of like throughout my life, I just seem to have an intuitive tendency to want to reject objective-driven type of endeavors and go in the opposite direction. And so it probably started out as a personality issue. maybe it's a personality problem, but so maybe a degree of rebelliousness, although it doesn't exhibit in all aspects of my life, but there's some degree of rebelliousness. But I think that it crystallized over time, especially at that moment when we started discovering this principle. Like if the moment sort of where we saw this principle in Picbreeder was probably transformative for me, because before that it would have been really implicit maybe in my personality, that I just kind of didn't like being told what to do, maybe you could say, or sort of felt intuitively that like sometimes I don't understand why I have to justify where I'm going when it's clearly very interesting in some objective manner. But when we started discovering this principle in a more formal sense in Picbreeder, it's like the discovery somehow like intersected with my personality and then really launched me to the point where I might use the word tyranny, although I don't think we really went as far as calling it tyranny. But yeah, then that really triggered eventually, the impetus to write a whole book about this, because I felt that it's not a topic of discussion right now in our culture. And I wanted to start that discussion at least, or try to start that discussion. Because you're not seeing demonstrations on the street about this, like, getting rid of objectives. This is a very, very entrenched status quo. So it's not even controversial that objectives basically rule our culture and our society. And so I guess it aligns with my personality, but I started to feel that there's a preponderance of scientific evidence to go along with it. And this leads to, I would also say, like, just because you're asking me sort of about why did this happen? I just want to point out that it wasn't, you're right, Keith, that the original paper didn't have that kind of radical bent to it, like the white paper on abandoning objectives. And I didn't start feeling this kind of radical view until I was talking about this for years. Like I kind of got on almost on tour because there was such a counterintuitive point, like you should abandon your objectives in order to achieve them. Like the discussions that I was getting at sort of computer science conferences after giving talks about this became more and more personal, until I started getting invited to places that weren't computer science conferences. Like one of the first one was the Rhode Island School of Design, where I spoke to a whole group of artists. And that was a really, for me, transformative experience, because it was like a cathartic, therapeutic session. I didn't expect that, but all these artists were thanking me and saying, finally, like, we understand why we're doing what we're doing. Like, we haven't been able to justify to our parents, to our teachers. We haven't been able to explain, why are we doing these things that seem, pointless, maybe you could say. And I started to realize that, like, this is a way bigger issue than just like an algorithmic concept that we have to think about in terms of, should we balance objectives with some other kind of diversification in algorithms? But this is actually something that's pervading our lives and actually inhibiting a lot of people from reaching their potential. And so I gradually came to the more radical view and wanted to express it that way after speaking a lot with a lot of people and realizing that it's becoming personal. It was a really strange thing. I mean, it was for me, it was entirely an algorithmic point that we were making. It's very, very dry and very scientific. And it just sort of dawned on me over time that this is not just about science. This is about our institutions in our personal lives. And so I came to this point through a transformation that happened over years. And that's why I'm now, sitting here acting like a radical about this. It's not like I just immediately started out that way.
At what point does the science no longer support your radicalism? Because we kind of have another pervasive problem in society today, which is that people take science and extend it far beyond like what the science actually tells us. It's kind of like, oh, if science hints at, 5% of the time we have a certain problem. Some agenda-driven people out there are going to say it's actually 95% of the problem that we have. So do you run the risk of kind of getting off the firm, foundation that you had, say, in the white paper and moving kind of into areas where, in fact, you don't have evidence to support that radical view?
It is a risk, but we'd have to really analyze, whether this is actually happening, like in the arguments that we're making. I mean, clearly it's, before you read the book, it's a risk. But I think if you read the book, maybe not you, because I think when you read the book, you didn't feel that we got around that risk, but hopefully someone who read the book would see that we were measured in our approach and actually tried to be realistic about this. Like in that we're not, in the first chapter, we're saying, okay, let's concede that in many, many cases, objectives are effective and we should use them. And this is really about blue sky types of discovery and innovation, which is an important aspect of our culture. I mean, we thrive on that in Western culture and also in other cultures as well. And so it's very important that we run those kinds of things carefully, and people's lives are also affected by that. And I think, so we try to circumscribe where we're making this argument clearly, and maybe that failed in your case. But I think that it is actually realistically applied in our case. But we could argue about the details there. So I think that if it's extreme, like one of this 5% to 95% kind of like, just wishy-washy kind of talk, new age kind of talk, you could go in that direction. But one of the reasons that we wrote the book was because we have all this empirical evidence. This is not like a new age feel-good self-help book. They don't start out with like a bunch of scientific experiments with empirical evidence. It's true, though, that like the extension of the empirical evidence into normal life, we could argue about, and I guess we probably will. But I think that those extensions are reasonable. And what's happening here is just that the status quo is resistant to a challenge because it's not used to it. This is not the kind of thing most people challenge. Like just that, hey, if you're going to do something, measure progress towards it. That's just like obvious to 99% of people out there. And so to strenuously argue that like that actually is not a good idea, that's tough to swallow, I think. And so I think what's actually happening is just that the status quo is naturally resisting the fact that it turns out not to be the correct approach in many, many cases when we're striving towards this kind of blue sky innovation. And that's tough to swallow.
It's interesting. There is a subtle distinction that you make sometimes. On one hand, you say something like, sometimes we should drop our objectives in order to reach them, right? So sometimes we should let go of them in order to reach them. And there are certain discoveries. We want to reach the moon. We should drop the objective of building a better plane or something like this. But then in other cases, for example, in Picbreeder, there is no objective, right? So you drop the objective, but what you reach isn't necessarily what you wanted to reach, right? Mm-hmm. Do you see like is this for you two different paths?
Could I just have a quick go at that? Because the moon one is an interesting example. I think Kenneth would argue that all of the intermediate stepping stones for landing on the moon might not resemble the end goal. Picbreeder, we'll introduce that in a little while, but that's a little bit different. That is a kind of human augmented evolution process, where at every stage of the evolution cycle, humans can select things that they like the look of.
Well, rocketry is an interesting one because, in fact, the intermediate steps looked exactly like the end product of the Saturn V. You can trace a very clear evolution all the way back to like Chinese, sort of rocket fireworks and see how that was an optimization effort, like to build that rocket that got to the moon.
So what I'm getting at sort of is that if if you run something like Picbreeder, don't you run the danger of, sure, you'll reach something, but is that thing that you'll reach any useful?
Yeah, I get it. And actually, there's two parallel threads in this, in what we just discussed. So that makes it a little tricky to answer, because there's this one question that Yannic is asking about, like, the difference between becoming less objective in service of getting to, in effect, an objective, versus just being less objective with the knowledge that we don't even know where we're going, but it might be somewhere interesting. That's one interesting dichotomy. And then there's this other issue of, like, okay, if we did do something really, really impressive, like get to the moon, which we did, we could argue about whether we were being objective or not objective. Like, that's another issue, actually. And I agree, actually, with what Tim was saying about that latter issue, that I think a strong argument could be made that the stepping stones that lead there largely do not resemble there. Of course, though, that's going to be an argument, because it already was. We just started arguing about it. But I think that's a little bit orthogonal to what Yannic was pointing out. So I'll try to first address that, which is basically, yes, that it is true that the ultimate principle that the book is advocating does lead you to a point where you don't know where you're going. And therefore, it's not designed to produce a particular outcome that you had in mind before you went off on this journey. And is basically saying that you can maximize the potential for producing something really interesting if you're willing to drop knowing what that interesting thing is going to be. Now, in the long run, what that is basically you're generating stepping stones. So it means that all the things that we hope might happen in the future become more likely, but not any particular thing. Because the more stepping stones we have, the more places we can get. And so it's true that the stepping stone you end up on may not be where you planned to go, but I would argue that, like, you shouldn't be planning to go anywhere anyway if you're going to take this approach, because what you're actually trying to do is just uncover stepping stones anyway. But in aggregate, because we're all uncovering all of these stepping stones that otherwise wouldn't even exist, we have now made possible a whole new generation of stepping stones, some of which will be things that we hoped would happen in the future. Yeah. And this is what's opening up and making those things possible.
Ken made it clear in his book that even though the world has become saturated with objectives, they're not necessarily a bad thing. Modest objectives, for modest goals are okay, but really ambitious objectives that require discovery, creativity, innovation, and even happiness, those are the things that we're talking about that require a slightly different approach. Now, there are lots of examples of inventions that, if you look at the intermediate stepping stones, they don't resemble the final product at all. So Kenneth gave an example of vacuum tubes leading to computers, or microwaves being developed from radar technology, or even the internal combustion engine leading to aeroplane engines. And the really fascinating concept here is that creativity could be seen as a search problem. And that implies that we're searching through a space of things. And this is what fascinates me, because if we are exploiting something, if we're building a bridge and we already know how to build it, we can kind of visualize all of the intermediate steps from now to completion. But when we require creativity, we're actually searching through this space of possibilities.
Yeah, so I want to respond to something, though. So the first computers were not built with vacuum tubes. They were built with gears and machines, right? And then, so the story of computing has always been one where people wanted to do machine-based computing, and they surveyed the componentry that they had available to them, and then they put those together at a large scale to do computing, right? So I view this, it's two sides of a coin. You've got a bunch of people out there tinkering in garages, thinking outside the box, trying to violate the second law, painting weird things, great, right? And then when somebody needs to achieve a particular thing, they look at the toolbox of stepping stones and they put those together in some planned, organized, efficient, large-scale way to achieve that goal. These are not like, and actually the point's made in the white paper that these are complementary kinds of avenues, right? You really have to be doing both at the same time. So it seems like what we're really arguing about here is saying that, in Western society today, we're just funneling too much of a proportion of our resources onto objective pursuits and suppressing creativity. I argue we're not really suppressing creativity to start with, but we're arguing about really a balance of resources here, aren't we?
Well, this might be a good time to introduce this concept of deception. So I think if we have an objective approach, it blinds us to the stepping stones we should actually be taking?
Yeah, so I think that, Keith is really arguing for the status quo. Like that's not a very controversial point of view. Like basically you're saying that, okay, we things are going fine. We set objectives and this often works well, and we should have some exploration. Nobody's going to find that controversial. Everything's going fine. And I think that the status quo is very easy to argue for because we already have a consensus on the status quo and we like it. We think we're very smart and that's working well. And so you have to give some room here for the possibility that the status quo actually is not the best way to do things. And it's true that deception is a real enemy of the status quo. And it's not recognized how pathological and serious it is. Like this idea that it looks like you're moving in the right direction, but actually you're heading towards a brick wall. And we could be sidestepping this kind of brick wall much more often if we reject the status quo, which is this confidence that we know when the switch should happen, which is, I think, what really is implicit in what Keith is saying, is that, okay, you're recognizing and acknowledging that, yes, to some extent, creativity, innovation or exploration are things that should be part of what we do. But I'm arguing that, look, we just give it lip service right now because we may all think those sound really good on paper, but the gatekeepers do not actually reward you for doing that. Like in all kinds of institutions, that's not the way the world actually works. This is true in publishing. This is true in grant writing. They want to know what your objective is. They want to see metrics that show that you're moving towards that objective. It works just like some kind of naive local optimization problem in almost all these cases, which any expert on search would know is just completely naive, and yet we run society as if this actually makes any sense at all. And so somebody has to push against that status quo to start bringing it down so that we can actually move in directions sometimes, not because they're causing some metric to go up, but because they're simply interesting. And they're opening up possibilities to move in directions that will sidestep the brick wall of deception and actually get us to stepping stones that are going to get us to places that otherwise we are not going to get. And so all these gatekeepers need to really, really change their behavior. And we're not going to get there by simply saying, yeah, things are going pretty well here. Like anybody can go explore if they really want to, but like mostly things are good because like we have people making innovations using objectives anyway. Yeah, that's the status quo. Things are just going to stay the same. And I'm arguing that, look, that's actually not the best way to be doing things, that the pendulum has swung far, far in the other direction to the point where at this point, it's absurd. Like I said, we're running this like as if it's like the most naive optimization problem for like the most complex problems that we have in the universe. And this just doesn't make sense at all.
First of all, I'm on record actually in this show multiple times advocating against certain status quo. For example, I don't like the one-size-fits-all education system. It's absurd to me that life is filled with all these niches, and instead of figuring out what somebody would be good at and what they're passionate about and giving them the tool set to get to that niche, we try to funnel everybody down some uniform, path to college, 4 years, whatever, right? So what I'm hearing you say is that, and I agree that the pendulum has swung too far towards objectives. And I think I said that, maybe it's a balance of resources question. So I think what you're saying is the only way to rebalance that is to have this extreme viewpoint, very agenda driven, kind of shock the gatekeepers into kind of moving away, moving the pendulum towards that. That's fine. I worry that the science doesn't necessarily back that up. And there's this arguable point about, what is novelty? What isn't novelty? What's interesting? What's not? How much resources should we be putting down there? So I get it. But I think at the end of the day, we are arguing about a balance. It's like, okay, we have 95% of our resources heading towards objectives. That's a problem. Maybe it needs to be 80-20 or 50-50 or who knows, whatever it is. So, and that I would agree with.
It's not really that when you write a grant, 95% of the score of the grant readers is going towards, can you reach your objective? But right now it's 100, right? It's much more of this is the way we do things, right? You want to reach this goal, I give you money for reaching this particular goal. And that's just the way we write grants.
Yes and no, but some of those grants are to exploration objectives. Like people do get grants to do exploratory research.
What's on everyone's mind is, wait a minute, isn't novelty, isn't exploration, yet just another objective, right? That you're somehow maximizing.
You could argue that Kenneth is advocating for an objective, but it's the only objective which does increase monotonically, right? Because I think the argument is that all of the objectives we have at the moment create convergent behavior, not divergent behavior. And when you have a novelty style objective, you can monotonically, optimize on it and it works. But I wanted to comment that I agree that there is a preponderance of objectives in our society. And I don't think people realize how bad it is, whether it's in education, we want to monotonically increase our grades, whether it's in science, we have to have this convergent group think because all of the peer reviewers have to approve something, whether it's wanting to obsessively improve GDP metrics in our society. It's absolutely pervasive. I don't think anyone in this conversation is binary and wants it to be one or the other. I think we just want to have a slightly more open-ended approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, it's true that we have common ground on the idea that this is a question of degree. I mean, that's clearly true. So it's not like, Keith and I are on complete opposite ends of the spectrum. Like there's a matter of degree issue going on here. And so to some extent, this is actually a political discussion. And to some extent, it's not actually a scientific discussion. This is about how to affect social change in some sense.
Political discussions here.
I mean, so I come to this as a scientist, not qualified probably to make a good political point here. But
anyone is qualified to make political points.
Yeah, that's fair. That's probably true. But so my intuition about this political situation is that actually we need a really big push. We need a big push to budge us out of our rut, and to get us to that more reasonable balance. Whatever that may be, 50-50, whatever you want to call it. Like, I don't really think it's actually about the percentages as much as the types of problems. Like, I think it's more that, like, if you're a stepping stone away, this is sort of the way we put it in the book, then by all means, use objectives. Like, there's a lot of problems like that. Let's recognize that. Let's not make that 50-50. Let's make that 90-10, like that should be mostly just objective driven. But if you're many stepping stones away, which really means I don't have any idea what the intervening stepping stones are, like the 3, the 4, the 5, the 500 that are going to lead to that thing that I really want to see happen, then forget it. Then it should be the exact opposite ratio. And so we should be principled in that way and recognize that this is actually the way that search works. And we just totally are not that way. And so as a political point, I do think that it's important to push in a radical direction here and say, like, we really need institutional change because like the others are saying that, yeah, it is true that like in a lot of realms, like in grant writing, which I'm very familiar with, it's near 100%. I mean, you're right. There's special programs and things. There might be some exploratory grant program or something like that. But like in a conventional program, it's a National Science Foundation or something, screwed if you're just like, this is really interesting. I don't know. I can't tell you what we're going to accomplish, but like, it's just really cool. We should just look at this. It's funny because like that actually was the case with Picbreeder itself. Like I did try to get funding for Picbreeder. So maybe I'm here like, bitter about this now. This is why I'm sitting here arguing this. But like the Picbreeder was just shot down for this very reason. Like I have exact wonderful quotes from our reviewers about, it's not clear what this is going to accomplish. Like, why are you doing this? We don't really know. And what's funny is that like, I wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation with you guys today. We wouldn't be having this talk at all, which I at least think that we would agree is a valuable discussion to have. Absolutely. If we had let those gatekeepers be the arbiters of whether this thing should get out there or not.
All right. So I kind of get what you're saying now, which is that, the sort of guy in the garage, the starving artist, the out of the box thinker, there always has been kind of a stigma of like, yeah, they're just kind of over there, little small things doing their thing. We can largely ignore them, right? And what you're kind of saying is that society needs to put much more value on that process and understand, the fundamental contributions it makes towards other progress that we may objectively care about, let's say. But so let's suppose we get to that world. Like everybody goes, yeah, great. We love novelty search. We still have to allocate funding, right? So when somebody comes along and says, you know what, I want to research how Cheese Whiz can be used like in an agricultural setting, or just explore the properties of Cheese Whiz, like for that matter. Like, do we decide to fund that, and how much do we allocate? Like, how do we do societal novelty search, but in a way that at least gives us some some hope to progress along goals that society cares about.
You said, we want to encourage the artist in the garage and so on. And I think what we really want is for this...
No, the starving artist and the tech guy in a garage.
Okay.
Yeah.
What we really want is for this kind of treasure hunting just to be the modus operandi in all institutions.
I understand. I think that's what I said, which is that we need to understand as a society that type of effort needs to be institutionalized. But suppose we get there. How do we allocate funds and time?
Let me just quickly talk about how it works at the moment. So I've worked in the tech industry for many years, and what I see is a tragedy of convergent thinking. So, for example, that we might be building a big data platform in some corporation, and when it's designed, everyone is saying, well, I want to make money. This is my financial year. If you don't give me some metrics by next year, then you're not allowed to do it. And what that means is that all of the really innovative things that we could be building, we can't even conceptualize because we're constrained in the way that we've designed this system. Wouldn't it be great if we could advocate for a treasure hunting approach where we could allocate some budget? Now, how we allocate that budget, to your point, Keith, I don't know. Maybe Kenneth can tell us, but if we just allocated some money just for an open-ended search, just to create a fertile environment for search and innovation, even though we don't know where they will lead, but I guarantee you, let me say that another interesting thing, by the way, Kenneth, is we've been playing with GPT-3, and it's this language model, and it's deterministic by default, and if you sample it deterministically, you get stuck in, like a kind of greedy sampling, you get stuck in loops, and you don't really go anywhere. And turns out if you sample it randomly or do a beam search, it produces better language. Who would have thought it, eh?
Yeah, so, and actually I've had a lot of fun with GPT-3 as well after having joined OpenAI. So I have the privilege of being able to access it. So that is a lot of fun. So actually there's several threads going here. And I also want to acknowledge that we lost the thread of whether novelty is an objective that Yannic raised. So maybe we'll get back to that one. But I just want to address this because I want to address this point now, which does seem really important about how do we allocate funds? Like what is the principle here? And the thing that I think that we're missing is that we have invested enormous amounts in people through our social investments, like educating people. We're talking for decades, like 30 years, like to get to a PhD or something like that, to get them to a point where they're supposed to have intuitions, right? Scientific intuitions. Like they're not just supposed to be able to look at a chart and see that, algorithm X is actually performing better than algorithm Y by a significant amount. Like people love this, the significance computations, right? Because it's like, well, I can really hammer somebody on that. Like you didn't use the correct method, like to calculate significance or something. Like that doesn't take a PhD to do that. The PhD allows you to have intuitions about what are the directions that actually have promise. And what's amazing about us using these, like relying so much on these metrics, is that it is basically saying that we are not allowing people to use that education that they have because we don't trust them after 30 years of putting money into them, of investing them in our social investments, thousands and thousands of dollars, maybe millions. We don't trust them to have any intuitions at all. The only thing we trust is a significance test. And so at some point, we do need to say, because this person thinks that this path looks interesting, that we should listen to them. Now, how do we know? Of course, we don't just say, well, you have a PhD, so we listen to you. No problem. Like you can do whatever you want. Here's $1 million. That doesn't make any sense.
You've got to get your head out of the clouds, Ken. You can't be talking like that.
I think what we do need to do is start to understand that we can have discussions about why things are interesting. That's the thing that I think we can change. Like we are at a level together, if we have the right background. I'm not just talking about PhDs either. I'm talking about experts in any field, not just PhDs, whatever it may be. It could be athletes. It could be great chefs, like whatever you're talking about. Like these are people who have huge amounts of experience, which gives them the credibility to have these discussions. And of course, they should have these discussions with their peers, not with a random person on the street, but with their peers who similarly have that kind of a background and have been recognized for having that background about, and this is it's a very unsettling and uncomfortable topic for a lot of people, but what is actually interesting? And it's true. What happens that enters into those discussions is called subjectivity. And scientists just run away when they hear about subjectivity. It's not objective. Like, I can't talk about it. Like, this is getting me scared. Let's go back to some bar charts and significance tests. But come on, like, ultimately, everything that's ever been done that's interesting ultimately boiled down to some level of subjectivity. It's just that we covered it up because we're not allowed to talk about it.
Maybe we could try out like a little committee, an interesting voting system, interestingness voting system. It's like you propose an idea and then anonymously a bunch of your peers vote on whether or not that's interesting.
No, that's still convergent. That's the last thing you want.
Well, but Ken's saying that we need to trust intuition on what's interesting, right?
It's moving in a direction that I think is interesting. I think that, like, what you might get, I mean, maybe it's true. There's a convergent aspect to that kind of voting type of thing. Voting can be dangerous. We've seen that in Picbreeder too. There's experiments that show you get much worse results if you sort of vote about what's the best picture. But the idea that we can actually ask experts to discuss what's interesting, I think, is actually interesting. Like, it could lead to things. I've heard proposals even recently, things like, before we go to the results section, like, papers get through an initial filter just based on whether the idea is interesting. And that could lead to something different in terms of outcomes. So yeah, we're able to have these discussions about what's interesting. Right? We can do it informally. We're just afraid to actually air these types of things in any formal setting.
But aren't you scared that any filtering for interestingness, and you admit that interestingness is subjective, how can you even set up a filter for interestingness? Because that author might think that paper is really interesting.
Yeah, so that relates to this idea of the committee and the convergence and things like that. Like, what is actually the right way to maximize our gains from elevating interestingness in this way? And I agree that this should not be the only way we evaluate things ever, of course. Like, again, we're back to balance and degrees here. So I don't think all of society should work this way. But to the extent that we put some resources into doing things this way, I think that we have to think about it as, what is it that makes systems like Picbreeder work so effectively, open-ended systems in general? And what it is basically, it's the connection between one stepping stone and the next. So it's like, some things can lead to very, very interesting things down the road, but somebody has to make that connection. And so I think what the issue is that it's not a voting issue, because, like, the majority is not going to make that connection. Like, if there's a very, very salient stepping stone for you, just for you, this could change your life. Like, if you look at this picture of this butterfly or something like this, it will not be true of the majority of people. And so we will never get to follow down that path if it's a majority rules type of voting situation. We need you to be able to follow your special instinct, because that was the thing that could change only your life. That's the thing for you. Yeah. And this is about what's interesting. This is totally subjective. I mean, that's just you like butterflies. And so what we need to do, I think, is create systems where people are willing to put a stake into things. Like, they're willing to put something up to say, look, I'm willing to give up some of the bonuses that I have in my life. And if this is a grant system, maybe you're even willing to give up getting a grant to say, I'm going to stick up for this thing, because if this gets done, it's going to mean a lot to me, because it's extremely interesting and I want to see it happen. And so we could set up a system like that. And then we know, because the stakes are high, that people are not just sort of gratuitously or casually making these decisions. They're making these decisions because they matter to them and because these stepping stones resonate with them. So we need to carefully set up the system. But I think then we can encourage people to have these kinds of elevated discussions and bring out the fact that actually this is the thing that humans are best at. It's not like just producing a bunch of objective formal results. That's not what we're great at. Computers are great at that. They're better than us at that. We have a nose for the interesting. That's how we got this far. That's how civilization came out. That's why the history of innovation is so amazing for the last few thousand years. And so let's elevate that. Let's talk about it seriously and give each other credit for the fact that we can do this on both ends, both the person making the proposal and the person critiquing the proposal. We can talk about what's interesting, but we just don't need it to be consensus driven, because that's not how stepping stones work.
I think that's the key point. We need to have autonomy. We spoke to Max Welling on Friday, and he said that when his students come up with an idea, no matter how bad it is, he will zip his lips and he won't say anything. He'll let them explore it for a month. because you just never know. What's interesting to you might not be interesting to me. And when you have this kind of groupthink, when you all get together and decide if something's interesting or not, there'll always be a clash because it won't be interesting to someone else, and then that will cut the idea off. And one of the things with Picbreeder, and also you mentioned in natural evolution, and with some of your approaches like the Poet paper, it's all about creating a divergent search. And in evolution and in Poet, it's about actually creating problems and solutions at the same time, allowing you to create this beautiful space that you can just continue to explore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, autonomy is a really big part of this, and it's destroyed by these committees. Committees and autonomy just don't go together. Grants are basically run by committee, and yeah, it's exactly true. And something we saw very strikingly in Picbreeder, that like the reason that everything is being discovered there in that particular search space, which is actually a very relatively simple search space compared to, say, the space of invention, which is like thousands of times higher dimensional. But even in this small, lower dimensional space, where those images are, between dozens and hundreds of dimensions in terms of what defines them underlying. So it's a relatively low dimensional space. Even in that space, like, we needed to give people room to follow their interests to their bitter ends without some committee intervening and saying, actually, we don't think it's interesting to go down this path. Sorry about that. Like, you should actually look at this image instead. And we know that because there was another project, and I hate ranking on it because I thought that was a really cool project too, which was called the Living Images Project, which got a lot less attention because it was the exact opposite. It was committee driven. So it makes a really great contrast. Like, it's a really nice metaphor for the way we run society, because the Living Image Project basically works like the NSF. They'd show the palette of current leading images and say, okay, let's have a vote now by committee. We're going to figure out which the most promising ones are. And it just led to a bunch of wallpaper patterns, or probably even worse than wallpaper patterns, because they didn't even have like symmetry. It's just like kind of pleasant looking blobs after this, like thousands and thousands of votes were cast. And it's because like the thing is, like, everything washes out when we start ruling by committee. Like, we have to allow people to follow their passions to their extremes. And of course, most of those bets won't pay off. I mean, venture capitalists know this. That's the nature of investing. We're talking about risk ultimately here. Like, risk has to be tolerated in order to make great discoveries. So it's not like, oh yeah, every time anybody's allowed to follow their interests, like, great things are going to happen. Most of the time, no. But it's worth it to maintain this portfolio so that we can get them to go to their extremes and see these amazing results. So yeah, we've got to start getting rid of these committee-driven types of systems and look at different types of systems, which is why things like having, say, 5,000 grant reviewers instead of like 5. But you get your grant funded if like 2 people are willing to put up something really big to say, like, yeah, this is going to change my life. And that's enough. And so that's a much more like Picbreeder-like world than the Living Image type of world.
Crowdsource funding.
You said before that your personality naturally matches with this kind of idea and the things you've discovered. Do you, besides your personality just matching, do you make deliberate steps, deliberate attempts in your life to implement these ideas of less objectives, more exploration, and so on?
I think so. I mean, obviously, discovering these principles helped me to justify being that way more. So maybe I'm more like that now since I've been improved my ability to make this kind of argument. Maybe I'm still not optimized it completely, because Keith makes some good points here that show that we still have to defend this. But still, I've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about this. So now it's just easier for me to say, well, the reason we should do this is because we've thought about this for several years, and here's why we're going to do it this way. But yeah, like something like Picbreeder is an example. Picbreeder, I had no idea what the heck we're going to see from that. Like, it was like, I don't think most objectively comfortable researchers would want to make a Picbreeder, because it's like completely unclear what the point is. It's like the most salient point is probably that it looks like a fun toy. But that's not usually why we make things as researchers. It's just because they're a toy. But that wasn't my motivation at all. My motivation was entirely that I was pretty sure that something interesting was going to happen. I was like, if you just release like thousands of people online to just explore picture space, like, we're going to see a phenomenon that we've never seen anything like. But I don't know what phenomenon it is. I had no idea. But it's just going to be so cool. And there's no question that something like will fall out of it that'll be valuable, because it's just so interesting. And lo and behold, like, my entire career was diverted because of doing this. And indeed, like the NSF committee was totally turned off, as you would expect, because like it's not clear what the point is. So yeah, I think I make decisions because I think things are interesting, and I'm not afraid to. Like I will tell people who I work with, like, I think we should do this because it's interesting. I don't really know what we're going to find, but we need to find out. And it's pretty clear. But I won't just say it like that. Like that's the thing, is that's the naive view. And the argument against doing what I'm saying is to believe that that's the whole argument somebody like me would make. Like, hey, this is interesting. Like, you should follow me. Just do this because it's interesting. Like, obviously, I need to justify it to that person. So like if I have somebody that I'm managing or advising, and I'm saying, here's something I'm proposing that we should do together, I will really try to get into the details of why it's interesting. I'm not just going to say it's just interesting, let's just do it. But it's like, look, these are all these opportunities that this opens up that basically create a whole new playground of opportunity, which is arguably going to reveal things that nobody has ever thought about before. And I'd get into the details of why. And if I can't persuade them, then I'm satisfied that I don't have a good argument. Because I fully believe that we at our education level or experience level in our fields, because like I said, you don't have to have a PhD, you can be in some other field, that we can have an argument like this with each other and be completely reasonable about it, even though it's not ultimately objective. And so I think people should have a right to hear my case, why things are interesting, and reject it. And that's totally reasonable. But if I can get it to resonate with you and you want to follow that stepping stone with me, then I think we've made a great connection, and it's much more exciting than that I have a bar chart with a significance result on it.
Just my 2 cents on communicating this, because I think part of pushback you may get from some people is that if you're not careful to make a distinction between divergence and interestingness, because a lot of divergence is not interesting. Like, oh, look, I have a pink dot on my shoe. Congratulations. I don't care. Right. And so in the paper, you kind of make this point, too, which is that, yeah, look, not all divergence, not all novelty, if you will, is actually interesting. And it's an open area of research as to defining what exactly is interesting, or coming up with this objective that helps to find novelty that's actually interesting. I think that may be some of the nature of the pushback, because we've all been around, new age people that are like, look, I've decorated my house in crystals, and I'm like, yeah, no, like I couldn't care less. Right.
I think novelty is the wrong word. I think Kenneth said in much of his work that a better description is being an information accumulator. So, for example, you can keep crashing into the wall in the maze, but eventually, what if I could actually do something more interesting in my policy? And in order to do that, I would need to accumulate useful information. And it works really well, because even in evolution, there seems to be an arrow of complexity that goes through the evolution of life on this planet. And being able to breathe air and being able to see photons of light, being able to climb trees, all of these things help us exploit our environment more effectively.
Yeah, but I want to point out there's way too much context shifting, both in the paper and in the book, jumping back and forth between information versus interestingness versus novelty versus complexity. These are not the same thing. And there's actually are examples in both the book and the paper of context shifting. I mean, the sort of logical fallacy of starting off in one context and then sort of magically eliding over to like a different one. So these are not the same concepts. And I think the one that actually will resonate with more people is interestingness, because tons of information is flat out boring. Okay. Like the exact precise trajectory of a missile. Really not excited with that. Right. Or what you ate today for lunch.
You may be highlighting useful strategic angle here. I'll acknowledge that. How do you effectively communicate these points? And I do think that it's worth thinking about that. Like the book is an attempt to do that. And it's true that some people are turned off by it. So maybe it could be more effective. I have to agree with that. But I don't think, I think what you're calling context shifting for me was an attempt to provide multiple different angles of argument to support this. So like when Tim mentions information accumulation, which I'm really flattered that, you remember all these things I've said. So that's certainly, I'm happy to hear you making those arguments, because these are arguments that I put out. Like these are just different angles of attack from making the argument for divergent, non-objective type of search. And the information accumulation one I think is really interesting, and it's complementary, in my view, to arguments about divergence and interestingness and so forth. And not like some kind of, sort of dishonest, subtle shifting, trying to move the ball around, but just trying to give lots of different arguments. And the reason we wrote the book that way was the book was really meant to be a weapon. It's because people who are the gatekeepers, who are in charge of the flows of funds that control whether certain things get done or don't get done, are generally very objectively driven. And I wanted to give people who are trying to satisfy those gatekeepers as many possible arguments as they could get. And they could choose and pick and choose from those arguments. And that's why the book is not written in necessarily the most crowd-pleasing way. It's more like, look, I'm just going to put out here all of the arguments that we can think of, and you're going to be able to use them. And so I understand that for some people, it's just a turnoff from the start. So it's really, this is sort of an honest outpouring of my thoughts about this without selling out and just trying to make something for public appeal, which is something that we considered. I mean, we went through literary agents and things that had all kinds of suggestions for watering this down so that it'll appeal more. But then I just started to feel like it was turning into a sellout. And so that's why it's this weird mishmash of like self-help, like combined with like empirical scientific arguments. And you're like, what kind of book is this? And who is this for? And it's not really for anything in particular. It's just meant to be a weapon.
I get it. But by the way, I'm not suggesting that you dull the weapon. I'm suggesting that it be sharpened, because for at least some people out there like myself, I'm totally not opposed to the idea of the importance of, interestingness. But I really can't abide sort of illogical arguments. And so when I see things that don't logically follow, non sequitur, context shift, appeal to emotion, begging the question, et cetera, to me, it becomes like less effective. And so I understand it's a balance. You're trying to create a weapon, and there's a bell curve out there along every single personality attribute and whatnot. I get it. I'm suggesting that a focus on interestingness alone is a very sharp kind of tool.
To that point, because that is a good point, actually. I think that interestingness really is central here. It's a very important part of this. And it comes up a lot in these kind of discussions. I mean, it's related to like what should guide divergent type of search processes. I mean, you're following a gradient, but it's not the gradient of objective improvement. So what gradient is it? And it's true that I think the gradient of interestingness is probably the best expression of like the ideal divergent search. But then, you get to this problem that like, I don't know how to formalize interestingness. And so it leaves it a little bit less concrete than what we have in like normal machine learning, obviously, where we know exactly what gradient we're following. And so what you get to then are proxies for interestingness. And so things like novelty, the good thing about novelty is that it's true that not everything that's novel is interesting, but just about everything that's interesting is novel. And so it's like a pretty good, like rough heuristic for getting to see some of what a true interestingness-driven search would reveal, which would be even more powerful. Now, something like Picbreeder is much more kind of like close to like actually following gradients of interestingness, because it's human beings that are making the decision, and humans arguably make decisions on what's interesting when they look at pictures. But we all have different definitions implicitly about what is interesting, which makes it even more interesting. I mean, that's why more stepping stones for you are different than the stepping stones that I would follow, which is why it ends up being divergent. But it's very hard to formalize this, right? It could be even AI complete, like to really get interestingness in that sense, like to be in it, just run completely autonomously in a computer. And so we need to look for proxies. And we also need to recognize that interestingness is a subjective concept. And therefore, we really never will formalize it in an objective way. And so we have to accept some degree of subjectivity as we try to formalize these sort of gradients of interestingness. And that's sort of, from the algorithmic perspective, what we should argue about is like, what level of formalization is acceptable here that is likely to lead to an unfolding process that's really cool in the long run. And it's okay that it's partly subjective.
Could we formalize what it might look like? Because being very naive, the helicopter view is that we definitely don't want convergent systems. We want to have divergent systems that are rich in information. And also, we don't want to have shortcuts. You mentioned some perverse incentives, like, for example, in India, they paid a ransom, didn't they, if you handed in dead snakes, but that just led to snake farms. And a similar thing in Hanoi with the rats. People started breeding rats, and the actual opposite of what you wanted to happen happened. So we don't want to have those shortcuts. We don't want to have those perverse incentives. So if I did design such a system and I had to design some measure of interestingness or information accumulation, and I analyzed this system, what things would I be looking for as a measure of success?
Yeah, so I think we have to distinguish between systems with humans in the loop or not. So which one are we? Because I think with humans in the loop, we might trust to some extent that like there's a human brain involved. So that helps a lot.
This is fascinating. We have quite a technical audience, so we can take the level up about one step. So it was using these CPPNs, these compositional pattern producing network, and with NEAT, that was a genetic algorithm for evolving the weights and topologies of a neural network. But in Picbreeder, it was an entirely human supervised process. So presumably you did know how to cross over two networks, but it was supervised by the humans every single step of the way.
Yeah. Part of NEAT is in Picbreeder. So the NEAT precedes Picbreeder. Like so, one of the things that allows Picbreeder to do what it does is the fact that the networks are becoming more complex as the breeding process goes forward, because there's a NEAT-like algorithm under the hood. Except, as you say, there's a big exception, which is the selection decisions are not being made by NEAT; they're being made by people. So it's like a hybrid of people and NEAT together.
It brings out an interesting, no pun intended, interesting thing in that I don't know what your opinion on trolls and trolling is, but I just think of trolls as people that do things primarily because they're interesting to them, and they almost shy no effort to just do something interesting. And I'm just wondering, what if a group of trolls decide to troll Picbreeder? Would they deliberately do non-interesting things? Is like or because that would defeat their purpose, or would they do interesting things and then that would defeat their purpose as well? It's like you've made the perfect system against trolls.
I had not thought of the connection with trolls. That's true. Trolls have a sort of instinct for interestingness of their own, and it can actually lead to things that we wouldn't otherwise see or think. So trolls have a value. Trolls and Picbreeder is an interesting question. They, if somebody was adversarial towards Picbreeder, like a really bad troll, like really trying to wreck it or something, I guess they could really try to just publish all kinds of garbage. I mean, I guess that's what you would do. But it's not going to be that effective, because the system is designed basically to try to raise things up that people find interesting. So people just aren't going to respond to that kind of stuff. Now, if you had a troll army, I do think you could probably wreck Picbreeder. It's thousands of people, and then they sort of work together to try to vote up things, elevate things that are just horrible. Yeah, it would wash out the stuff that we're trying to elevate, so people could find, like they could mislabel things intentionally. Like people put keywords, so if you found a face, you could write face. Well, if they called it like a dog, I mean, it's going to mess things up. So yeah, I think with enough effort, we could screw the whole thing up. But most likely, like one troll is totally harmless. Like this stuff would just never rise up, and we wouldn't see it. And then there's the other kind of troll, which is somebody who just has different interests. He just says, like, all these images, there's these skulls in these cars. This is not the kind of thing that I think is cool. I think like these weird line patterns or something, there should be a lot more of those. That is healthy, I think. That's great. Have that divergent branch of the tree of life, and let's reveal it. There were people like that. There was this guy, Robert, that was his screen name, because he was so memorable because he created thousands of images, an unbelievable amount of work involved. But he was doing these line studies, like he was trying to get as straight a line as possible. Like with the activation functions in these CPPNs, it's kind of hard to get things that are just straight. So this guy was really obsessed with like squares that have real corners, 90-degree angles, and like just told these whole giant studies. And it's like just totally different from what everybody else is doing. But it's great because like branching off of those things leads to a completely different world and changed my view of what a CPPN or even a neural network is. Because once you get into those spaces with these sharp angles and straight lines, people were saying, well, there's this like Picbreeder style. It's kind of this like curvy, like kind of blobby looking kind of style that like everything has. It's actually not true. Thanks to this troll, we know that you just need to break into this part of the space and you've got a very sharp, well-defined kind of style. So yes, trolls, if you call that a troll, I think it can be useful and interesting.
That's super awesome. So I do want to get back to the kind of it seems to all hinge on very much kind of a definition of interestingness and what proxy you choose for it. Tim mentioned, for example, this: if you crash into a wall repeatedly, you might once go around it. But then again, if you crash into the wall the 22nd time, that's novel to crashing into the wall the 21st time. And maybe the 23rd time, the world is suddenly going to open up. You don't know, right? As long as you don't define some notion of novelty, everything is novel, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, this is an issue that ultimately these algorithms depend on some definition of interestingness, and even beyond algorithms. Then, like if we're advocating doing things like this in the real world, gatekeepers like eventually confront this issue of the open maze, like just running off into oblivion. What's the point of that? This has to do with notions of open-endedness and like what makes them work. And it's true that you do not have a successful open-ended system just by virtue of the fact that it's open. There has to be some constraint. There's still some constraint because we have finite resources in terms of space and time. Like if we had infinite resources, which we don't, but hypothetically, I don't think this would be a problem. We would literally just collect every branch of everything forever. And we have infinite space and time, and so we'll just do it. And everything great would be revealed. Of course, most things that we see would be junk. But who cares? We get everything great too. But we have finite resources, so we have to have constraints. So, and then that leads to, well, what are the constraints? Like a lot of the time when we talk about these things, like people think of it more in terms of like expressing what I like what do we actually want? I think of it more like, well, we need to express what we don't want because everything else is fine. Let's see all the stuff that if it's not something I don't want, it could be really useful. And in fact, I have a problem even with things I don't want because they might be stepping stones to things I do want. So being too careful about this in some sense could actually wreck the process. But ultimately, there are some things we have to exclude. We cannot afford to look at everything. That's just going to be a random search. And so what should we exclude? And it goes back to notions of interestingness. And absolutely, we should really dig into this. And I mean, I don't know on the show, we can do it in the show, but just in general, it's very important for the field to dig into what does it mean to be interesting. And, I think evolution is somewhat instructive because evolution does have some constraints and evolution is an incredible open-ended process, like the process that produced all of living nature, which is, as I like to say, literally biblical in terms of what it's accomplished. And so you can look at it and see that clearly it does have some constraints. Like there are some lineages that are not followed. They fail. And yet, like if you look at the reasons for that, mapping that to like the word interesting is a pretty large distance. Like this idea of survive and reproduce and then interestingness, it's not completely clear that those are like directly connected to each other. And yet it seems perfectly good at finding things that are interesting. Like I'd argue everything's interesting in nature. That could just be me. But that sort of illustrates to me one thing here is that you don't have to be perfect about this. Like if you can have a reasonable constraint, and we can talk about what that means, like what is reasonable? There's a lot of thought that we can have behind that. But you can do pretty well here. Like it doesn't have to be perfect. We don't have to really, really formalize the notion of interesting down to like the last iota of information because we don't really know. But as long as it's reasonable, like something like survive and reproduce can be incredible in terms of the power because of the power of divergence and the fact that it's pruning out enough junk that it's going to produce mostly cool stuff.
So I'm glad you made this point because I remember from the book, it brought up this example of imagine a world in which there was no selection pressure, and all organisms survived, like how amazing that would be. And my thought was it wouldn't be interesting at all because it'd just be a massive gray goo consisting of like nearly identical bacteria that reproduce at the fastest conceivable rate. Like if you don't have that minimal selection, you actually don't end up with an interesting world. It's kind of like white noise is not interesting and neither is a constant number. Like something in between those two is interesting.
Yeah. I mean, that was meant to be a thought experiment in the book, which we called it the gentle earth because everybody gets to have a baby no matter what. So it's like, you don't need to have sexual organs because God will make a baby for you in this hypothetical thought experiment.
That's right.
And it's true that the vast majority of the world would be gray goo. I'm totally with you on that. But what I thought was interesting about the thought experiment is that we'd still have all the cool stuff we have today. There would be humans, as long as we had the same mutation distribution. So it's like, that's part of the distribution of mutations that happen, because it did happen. And so those paths would be followed, in addition to the fact that 99.99999% of those paths are just goo, inert blobs lying on the ground. And that is just weird to think about, because it shows that like our existence is not entirely explained by selection. Like part of it is actually about the structure, the a priori structure of the search space that this universe has defined for us, that we have exploited through evolution. Yeah. And I find that very intriguing.
I was going to ask about that in the relation of CPPNs, because presumably there is a kind of prior in the activation functions and so on. But coming back to evolution, you said a really interesting thing. One of the things that concerns me is that in a way it's depressing that you can't shortcut innovation and discovery. There's this huge array of stepping stones that you need to find. And in evolution, if we wanted to turn the clock back, you made this thought experiment in your book. Let's say you wanted to pick all of the single cell organisms and you wanted to breed an Einstein. So you're just going to start from the very beginning and you're just going to breed all of these things together. And none of the intermediate stepping stones look anything like intelligence. Actually, we're trying to create artificial general intelligence at the moment. And probably none of the intermediate stepping stones that we see now will in any way resemble artificial general intelligence. And the depressing reality is that it is a search problem. And is it safe to say that when we talk about evolution, what we actually want is maximal exploitation of our environment, because there's a trade-off between exploration and exploitation. And we talk about wanting interestingness or novelty or whatever it is, but isn't that just a proxy for exploitation of our environment?
That is an interpretation of what makes evolution powerful. That might be even just thought of as like a restatement of different ways of saying like what's powerful about evolution, like exploitation of the environment or the satisfaction of a minimal criterion. But the thing that's missing from that I think you have to remember is that we are part of the environment. So like there's more to it than just that. Like that maybe is one of the critical elements that is to get to Einstein. There's that objective paradox. And so you can't get to Einstein by trying to exploit the environment. But it's like not the only thing that you need to get there, because there's these other principles, like the fact that we are part of the environment ourselves. So the environment is not a static thing. The environment is us. And so we are creating the opportunities that can lead to Einstein. It's like the trees and the giraffes. You can't have giraffes if you don't have trees. You can't have Einstein if you don't have other people to appreciate and interact with Einstein. And so there's a whole set of principles that need to be in place to be able to get to something like Einstein through an open-ended process. And I would argue that we still don't know what all of them are. Like this is an open area of research.
Do you find it depressing, though, that someone from the future can come into his or her time machine and come and talk to us today, and there are all of these incredible inventions that have been invented in his or her time, and this person wants to imbue us with all of these cool ideas, and it's kind of depressing that we can't take any shortcuts.
There's plenty of shortcuts, many.
Yeah, if you knew where you'd be going at. I think this brings us back to this notion of what if we have an objective, but maybe it's far away, like how do we reach it? And that actually brings me to two algorithms of yours or where you've been involved that fascinate me. So the big one is Go Explore, and that's, as I see it, part built on map elites. So and just brief for people who don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong. Basically, what map elites does, it sort of subdivides a search space into cells. And then what you want to do is, for each cell, you kind of want to keep the most promising candidate around. So you want to keep the most promising neural network for the small learning rate, and then one for the medium learning rate, and one for the large. And then you can kind of cross over. You can take some, change them, and if they happen to end up in another cell and get better than the thing that's there, you replace them and so on. So your goal is to build up this almost kind of population, but that's separated by force. And in Go Explore, it's kind of, it was so amazing, right? Everyone was trying to solve Montezuma's Revenge, and everyone's like, yeah, we almost can do level 1. And then, you come along and it's like, boom, we solved the game, done, bye. But so my question there would be that it seems like you have an algorithm for general exploration, but there seems so much domain knowledge in that, right? So the way you subdivide this parameter space in map-elites, or the way that you assign these different cells to explore in Go Explore and so on, isn't that almost the same as Tim saying there's someone from the future that sort of knows what to do, and you're almost kind of building that knowledge into the algorithm, but you're sort of hiding that you do that, right? It's the question is, could you do the same thing for when you don't know the stepping stones? Because in Go Explore you do.
Yeah, that's a great question. This is getting into the weeds of the research, really, where like it is sort of at the cutting edge with these types of algorithms, including like map elites, which just to acknowledge is not something that I was involved in creating, although it's in this area of these type of novelty. I mean, it's one of these quality diversity algorithms that was originally inspired by novelty search, so it's definitely in the right category, and a beautiful algorithm also, by the way. But yeah, when you start to talk about how to subdivide the space, or in novelty search, how do you measure the distance between two things for the purposes of maintaining divergence or diversity, you end up, and Go Explore, how you divide up the cells. You end up making a decision as a human being, which is based on sort of domain knowledge. That's true. And from the like sort of high aspirations of machine learning, we would rather not have to make decisions like this. There's fewer hyperparameters, and it seems sort of sad that we have to do that as humans. And so I think that in this field, I mean, if you want to call this a field, and like map elites would be in sort of like the field of quality diversity. That's sort of what they're calling these kind of algorithms, or novelty search with local competition. There's like a bunch like this that do take into account some objective notions as well. Sort of as Keith alluded early on, like that, like, yeah, we can combine these notions. Of course, there's a issue of degree, and quality diversity is sort of about that. But then we get to this issue, even in the most pure form of like just novelty search, we don't even have a notion of quality of, what does it mean for two things to be interestingly different? And where do we draw those dividing lines, and how should the distances be measured? And it is currently an active area of exploration, even in just reinforcement learning. It's like curiosity-driven search. You have to make these kind of determinations of like what is different from what to a sufficient degree to be deemed novel in some way. And there are people trying to make completely generic measures of that. It's interesting to do that, to try to do it in a completely generic way. The enhanced poet has a little bit of a flavor of that, because it has this special measure, which is based on like how like a new environment re-ranks the quality ratings of agents. So you might say, well, that could actually be applied in many different domains. But then you could argue about like that there's some domains where that might not make sense and so forth. I mean, we're getting into the weeds, but the thing is that I think it's a fruitful area to look at how generic can we get, and get away from like having to have this kind of human insight into the domain. But I also think it's not terrible if we do have to have some human insight into the domain. It's not the end of the world. Like if having human insight into the domain did lead us to create an artificial Einstein, is anybody going to complain? I mean, it doesn't really matter. So at some level, it's okay as long as the results are really awesome.
Yeah, since we got onto this topic of kind of distance metrics, I wanted to ask one more technical question, then I'll give it back to you, Yannic, because this is something that kind of annoyed me in the paper that I wanted to ask about. For those who haven't read the paper,
just for the benefit of the recording, Keith is talking about Abandoning Objectives, Evolution Through the Search for Novelty Alone by Joel Lemon and Kenneth Stanley in 2011.
So in the maze search, it starts off by, we're going to run a network and it gets to some location in the maze. And the way in which we're going to measure novelty is compare its final location to the kind of archive of locations that we've stored, right? And then you talk about refinements to that. Maybe if we sampled the path, some k number of times, and then we looked at, I think it was the L2 norm, between those sort of that trajectory and all other trajectories. Okay, good. Then we get to the bipedal kind of walker, which was the second case in there, and it immediately starts off by saying, yeah, we've got to do the sampling because, the final location's just not really relevant to the way it was walking, which is kind of hand wavy to me. And then it makes this comment that the metric has no knowledge of the distance in which it walked. But if you look right up above it where the formula is defined, it's xk minus x0, i.e. the origin squared. So in fact, it automatically has built in the distance from the origin like in the actual, thing which is being compared, right? So in other words, points that are further away from the origin are naturally going to have a larger weight in the L2 metric when you start comparing, paths. So I guess my comments are, one, did I misunderstand anything there? And two, the hand waviness, I think, is really more just a function of that this is a new area of research. And so tying back into what you and Yannic were talking about is we have a long way to go as a scientific body of knowledge to really think about these novelty measures and interestingness measures, as we've kind of been talking about.
Yeah, so I think that there is an issue about the diversity measure, or what we call the behavior characterization with novelty search, or the BC, like how we characterize behavior. There's some vector that characterizes what this thing did, and it could be a trajectory of points it followed through or something like that, and the degree to which it aligns with what you're interested in, which actually could be something that we call an objective even. And it's true that if it's completely orthogonal to your interests, you probably won't like what you get. So I was thinking of say in the maze, if there's a robot in a maze and the robot has a light on its head that can flash at sort of any arbitrary time. If we just measured novelty based on the flashing pattern of the light and just ignored where the robot went, and if we actually care about it getting through the maze, clearly this is a really bad idea and completely stupid. And so indeed, there is a hand waviness to that. I mean, if that's how you want to kind of characterize it,
or intuition
or human intelligence or human insight to understand how our notions of novelty align with the interests that we actually have in the problem. We've noticed that you can sometimes have an orthogonal sort of non-aligned form of measure at the same time as an aligned form of measure. And that actually might even work better because of this problem that sometimes the stepping stones to things that you like are actually things that you don't like. And so there's actually a pretty complicated problem, and there's not an easy answer to it. But I think that the ultimate thing is that we just have to acknowledge that we have not eliminated the need for us to define something. In the objective world, you basically have to define the metric that sort of measures how close you're getting to the objective. In the novelty world, you have to define this novelty metric, and you still have to define something. I would argue, though, it's not a super terrible obstacle because it doesn't have to be perfect. That's one of the points the paper was trying to make, there's a whole variety of these behavior characterizations that all still work basically the same. They just have to be reasonably aligned.
Yeah, you made that point, in my opinion, very clearly with the showing how if you divide up the maze into a grid, that you just need a 4x4 grid or something to work well. In other words, you didn't need a high resolution grid. I think that kind of makes the point that the novelty metric itself can be quite loose in a sense. It just has to be minimally good.
This paper is the abandoning objectives paper, where we figure out the policy for this robot using NEAT, and a maze is a wonderful example of something that has deception. So here, for example, if the objective was monotonically improving on the distance to the final objective, then this would be deception. It would get stuck in a basin of attraction here. But the thing I found a little bit strange is it almost seems like cheating, knowing the distance to the final objective and optimizing on that. But I suppose there's not really much else you could use, because otherwise you'd have to do some kind of reward shaping to find out what an intermediate, a good position might look like.
Yeah, it's one thing that's really important about it is that it's really meant to be metaphorical. And so it's like the whole maze problem doesn't make any sense if you're thinking of it as something other than a metaphor. If you take it literally, it's not a really great example of anything. But it's supposed to be metaphorical in just the sense that search problems generally have this property that we really don't know the right kind of shaping measure. So we are in this kind of room with walls, and there are these dead ends. We don't know where they are in general. The maze is different in that you can see them literally. But the real truth is that we don't even know, we actually have tried this. You know what the path is through the maze. So you could just define the reward function such that it rewards you higher as you follow the actual correct path through the maze. Of course, this breaks the metaphor, because the whole point is in general, you wouldn't know the right path through the search space. If you did, you don't have any problems. But what's interesting that is even if you knew the path through the maze, it still will work worse. because there's more to the deception than just the structure of the maze. That's what's interesting here. There's other subtleties that are below the level at which we can visually perceive them, because this is about the search space of neural networks. Search space is not actually mazes. The search space is the underlying neural representations, and we really don't understand that.
You often make the assertion that all ambitious objectives have deception. Could you quantify why that is?
Yeah, that's an assertion that's trying to make the argument that Picbreeder connects to real life. Because I think that the inclination, if I make this argument about this objective paradox, which is basically that following an objective can be an impediment to achieving it, and if I base that argument on observations of Picbreeder, which is that in almost every case, the images that were discovered by Picbreeder users were discovered by people who were not trying to discover them. And that is because of deception. If I make that argument, then for many people, the first inclination is to reject it on the basis that, hey, Picbreeder is not real life. You're just exaggerating the implications here. There's something special about this Picbreeder system. So for me to extend this argument outside of Picbreeder, I have to make a strong argument that Picbreeder actually is like real life. And I do think it is. And the reason that I think it is because Picbreeder is actually much, much simpler than real life. Like in Picbreeder, if you take any arbitrary image, like the skull, and you say, okay, well, how would I get there from scratch? Like, we don't really know how to get there from scratch. Like, we don't know what the stepping stones are like at all. I mean, one set of stepping stones are now known because someone did discover the skull, and they happen to be things like a donut. There's a donut that you have to go through to get to the skull. There may be other trajectories. Obviously, there's infinite trajectories through search space, so that may not be the only one. But the point is, it's a counterintuitive one. And so this means that like anybody who's just saying like an expert on skulls, who's saying like, well, how close are we to a skull, is not going to accept those stepping stones. Like that metric of improvement of like how close are we to a skull is not the right one for following that trajectory through the search space. And my argument is that's the way, of course, all hard problems are. That's basically the definition of a hard problem. Like if you knew what the stepping stones were, it wouldn't be hard. We would just follow the stepping stones, of course. Quite. And not only that, but like Picbreeder is a joke in terms of its complexity compared to the real world. If this situation is coming up in Picbreeder, where we're talking about dozens or hundreds of dimensions maximum, can you imagine real world search spaces which are like millions of dimensions, like extreme complexity? They're going to be like orders of magnitude more complex. In other words, there are orders of magnitude more of these deceptive stepping stones inside of that trajectory towards that thing that we hope to finally find.
I would push back on a couple things there. One is, Picbreeder is a particular tool set. It's generative networks, right? Whereas if I was a person and I wanted to create an image of a skull, I would use Photoshop. And I would get it done in an hour, and it would be like much more resemblant of a skull, right? If I was a Egyptian pharaoh and I wanted to build the Great Pyramid, which hopefully we all agree are great achievements, I do it with a simple process of stacking, stones one on top of the other with a simple set of like generalizable tools. So the fact is that like in real life, in the real world, humans do very well by applying simple sets of tools in large scale planned projects to achieve great things.
But the difference is, if we already know what it is, we know what the pyramid is, that's exploitation, it's not exploration.
My point is those are still great things. So look, but those are still great things. Getting to the moon, building a pyramid, building the Hoover Dam, all these things were great accomplishments, and they were planned. And so
that's
like
engineering.
Even the title, I understand, which is, I've been trying to make this point from the beginning, that science and engineering are two sides of a coin. Right, and we progress by utilizing both. It's not a binary either or thing,
Okay, let me take that on. That's a good thing to try to argue about. So I think that what's happening there is you're not really letting me use Picbreeder as a metaphor. It's just a metaphor. Like the skull is not. The point is not that like the skull is something that artists would or would not find hard, or like artists don't know how to draw a skull. I mean, it has nothing to do with that at all. The skull is just a metaphor for something that we don't know how to get to. We don't know what the steps are to get to the skull in Picbreeder space. Indeed, I'm not talking about human space with a canvas and a pencil. Now, one interesting thing, though, is that most people can't draw a skull. Most people are not going to draw a skull even close to as good as that skull. So indeed, Picbreeder is actually allowing people to get to points in picture space that they couldn't get to normally, other than maybe some expert artists that actually do have that skill. But that's a side point, though. The main point is this is just a metaphor for complex search spaces in general where we don't know what the stepping stones are. That's all it's about. It has nothing to do with like whether somebody might be able to draw a skull or not. And so we are really in a situation like with something like curing cancer. It is like the skull. Like you can't just sit down with your canvas and just say, oh, well, let's just put the pieces together and just do this. Like we don't know what the heck the pieces are at all. So there's a whole bunch of discoveries that need to be made that haven't been made yet. We don't even know who's going to make those discoveries. They may not even be biologists. We have no idea. And so like we are in this situation where like if you just follow the path of things that seem like they're on the path to curing cancer, you're probably not going to cure cancer. I think I can confidently say that. This is why we need exploratory research funded by the NIH. And the NIH knows that we can't just only fund things which look like, hey, we've improved this outcome by 2% on like the death rate for this particular kind of cancer. That is not going to lead to the ultimate cure for cancer any more than, hey, this looks 2% more like a skull, so let's just go in this direction, because that's totally not the right path for getting to a skull. You're going to go to a deceptive dead end for sure if you follow that kind of path. So this is a completely metaphorical argument. You need to take it as that.
It's going with two sides, which is we need both discovery and exploitation, kind of like in our multi-armed bandit talk. Like, for example, there's a quote made in the white paper that said, yet its appeal is that it rejects the misleading intuition that objectives are an essential means to discovery. I don't know people who think objectives are a means to discovery. They think exploration is a means to discovery. They think objectives are a means to engineering, building, accomplishment, refinement, optimization, right? Which is perhaps even the bulk of what needs to be done. Like if I have 10,000 people that need to be housed, I don't need to discover a new type of house. I need to go build houses.
Yeah, but that is engineering. Right. So I don't think anyone, Kenneth has made it clear that objectives work really well for exploiting knowledge we already have, whereas they are incredibly bad for discovering new knowledge. As Kenneth just said so eloquently, that there's a universe of possibilities and knowledge out there waiting to be discovered. And we can only discover them by searching through this huge space of possibilities.
Yeah, and the tools to do that searching requires optimization and exploitation to perfect them. It's a dual. There's a dual process here.
Well, I mean, of course, our enlightened friends in the scientific community will agree with you and give lip service to exploration. There's no question about that. I just think that the behavior of people does not align with the things that you're saying that they say, like that they would acknowledge that exploration is important. When we accept scientific papers, it's almost always because something improved objectively. You can talk about exploration all day, but that's the way the community actually operates. So there's some disconnect here between sort of like these sort of high-minded types of discussion about how exploration is great and the actual way people operate in almost all fields, except maybe in art. Art is interesting because I think it can actually be instructive for us in our field. But the other thing is that if we think about objectives or exploration in terms of how, like, say, machine learning researchers talk about it, they don't really mean it in the way that I'm talking about. Like when they talk about exploration, they're just talking about when you take random steps, when you're not actually following the objective gradient. Like there's nothing random about following a gradient of novelty or interestingness. This is a totally different thing. And this is not the kind of thing they're talking about. They're like talking about is sort of like the exploration part is kind of like a throwaway part of the algorithm. It's just like you do something stupid. The smart parts are the parts where you're actually going towards the objective. So I'm saying we got to flip this completely. Like the smart part is the exploration. The dumb part is the objective part because it's freaking easy. There's nothing really insightful or interesting about just doing objective optimization. Yeah, we've got plenty of good algorithms for doing that, and it's not counterintuitive at all. It totally makes sense, but it's not going to get us hardly anywhere interesting whatsoever. So like giving it a lot of lip service and credit and saying, look how important objective optimization is, we should all be like really congratulating ourselves. I think it's just setting us in the wrong direction because it's not the thing we need to concentrate on to change the way that the community is moving. If we want to have disruptive change, we've got to start talking about what does exploration really mean? How do we actually implement it in real life and not just talk about it?
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think it's just important to maintain the connection that was made in the white paper, which is, maybe it's most efficient to take the most promising results from novelty search and further optimize them based on an objective function. I think that's a totally, sort of great starting point for me personally.
I mean, I want to give credit to that. A lot of people have that intuition just before you. I don't want to shoot down everything you're saying. It's true that at some point when we meet in the middle, there will be a role for objective optimization still. I mean, that's true, especially when you're just a stepping stone away. It's not as simple as you just switch when it's time, because the whole problem is we don't know when it's time. And that's the problem. That's why I think only visionaries really understand when it's time to switch. And that's sort of visionaries are often characterized as people who think about several stepping stones away, like a genius. It's like, I can see off on the horizon. How do I get to this thing that nobody else knows how to get to? I don't think anybody can do that. Nobody knows that. What a visionary is somebody who realizes that suddenly something has snapped into view and the rest of us didn't. And then it's time to make the switch. But that takes real insight. That's like Steve Jobs seeing, that we can get from the iPod to the iPhone. That's not everybody just say, oh, okay, now we're in the valence, let's start doing optimization. That's really tricky.
I wanted to touch on, just in closing, there are different views. So there are schools of thought in the machine learning world, right? There's compute-driven versus knowledge-based, and model-driven versus data-driven, and symbolic or statistical, and white box or black box, and generative or discriminative. And you're coming at this from a really interesting angle, which is you're an advocate of neural networks, and you think that we need to have a search-based paradigm to find things. So do you think a search approach could lead to intelligence?
Yeah, I think that it is an important element. It may not be an either or situation where it's just there's just one paradigm, that's the paradigm. But I do believe that search, as you're putting it, which really means searching for the AI as opposed to just constructing the AI by hand, I guess you could say, which is my colleague and friend Jeff Kloon calls these AI generating algorithms, or AIGAs, algorithms that generate AIs. Instead of actually making the AI, we make the algorithm to generate the AI. I totally think that that's important. And that, we ourselves as humans with human intelligence are the product of a process like this. There's an outer loop that explains our existence, which is not itself a human level intelligence. It's this evolutionary algorithm, which is still not fully understood. If it was, we would just program it to the computer and then we'd get human brains to come out, and we don't know how to do that. But it's this outer loop that's an open-ended process, because it also produces things like photosynthesis or the flight of birds. It's not just designed to produce intelligence. It's an open-ended algorithm. And it's because of the fact that it gets around deception that it can get so far down the tree of search to something like us, which is just an extreme level of complexity, astronomical, that this is probably an important element, but not the only element. These other kinds of progress that are happening in the field should enter into it and dovetail, I think, with stuff like that, as opposed to we're at odds with each other and in partisan camps or something like that. And so I see these different stepping stones being brought together, just as they often are in the history of invention. You take an airplane and you take an engine, and eventually you get a spaceship. And I think, the history of engines and the history of the aerodynamics, which goes back to people who are making bicycles, are different trajectories, but they eventually are brought together by people like the Wright brothers. And this can happen here too. And so that's what I expect to happen if we ever do get that far to human level stuff.
Well, Professor Kenneth Stanley, thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. That was a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It's an honor.
Really appreciate it.
It was an honor. Amazing.
Thanks to all of you.
I've been excited about this for literally months, so it's finally happened.
I can attest to that.
I forced Keith to read your book in June.
Poor Keith, but thank you. I really appreciate everybody's input here. This was a great time. This is one of my favorite experiences of any show. So thanks for having me on. It's really an honor to be here.
Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. We love reading your comments, and we'll see you back next week.